Oh, good. Bigger font too. Thanks.
Namo Vishnu Padaya Krishna Prasada Bhutale Srimati Bhakti Vedanta Swami Niti Namde Namaste Saraswati Deve Gauravani Prachane Nirvisesha Sundari Asata Visatarane Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Hara Srivasadi Gaura Bhakta Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Srila Prabhupada, Chapter 22. Swami invites the hippies, January 16th, 1967. As the United Airlines jet descended on the San Francisco Bay Area, Srila Prabhupada turned to his disciple Ranchor and said, "The buildings look like matchboxes. Just imagine how it looks at this point." Srila Prabhupada was 71 years old, and this had been his first air trip. Ranchor, 19, and dressed in a suit and tie, was supposed to be Srila Prabhupada's secretary. He was a new disciple, but had raised some money and had asked to fly to San Francisco with Prabhupada. During the trip, Srila Prabhupada had spoken little. He had been chanting Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. His right hand in his cloth bead bag, he had been fingering one bead after another as he chanted silently to himself. When the plane had first risen over New York City, he had looked out the window at the buildings growing smaller and smaller. Then the plane had entered the clouds, which to Prabhupada had appeared like an ocean in the sky. He had been bothered by pressure blocking his ears and had mentioned it. Otherwise, he hadn't said much, but had only chanted Krishna's names over and over. Now, as the plane began its descent, he continued to chant, his voice slightly audible, Krishna, Krishna, Krishna. And he looked out the window at the vista of thousands of matchbox houses and streets stretching in charted patterns in every direction. When the announcement for United Airlines Flight 21 from New York came over the public address system, the group of about 50 hippies gathered closer together in anticipation. For a moment, they appeared almost apprehensive, unsure of what to expect or what the Swami would be like. Roger Siegel says, "We were quite an assorted lot, even for the San Francisco airport. Mukunda was wearing a Merlin the Magician robe with paisley squares all around. Sam was wearing a Moroccan sheep robe with a hood. He even smelled like a sheep. And I was wearing a sort of blue homemade Japanese shamari robe with small white dots, long string of beads everywhere, buckskin boots, army fatigues, people wearing small round sunglasses, the whole phantasmagoria of San Francisco at its height. Only a few people in the crowd knew Swamiji, Mukunda and his wife Janaki, Ravindra Swarup, Roy Ram, all from New York, and Allen Ginsberg was there. A few days before, Allen had been one of the leaders of the Human Be-In in Golden Gate Park, where over 200,000 had come together. a gathering of the tribes for a joyful powwow and peace dance. Today, Alan was on hand to greet Swami Bhaktivedanta, whom he had met and chanted with several months before on New York's Lower East Side. Swamiji would be pleased. Mukunda reminded everyone if they were all chanting Hare Krishna when he came through the gate. They were already familiar with the Hare Krishna mantra. They had heard about Swamiji's chanting in the park in New York, or they had seen the article about Swamiji and the chanting in the local underground paper, The Oracle. Earlier today, they had gathered in Golden Gate Park, most of them responding to a flyer Mukunda had distributed, and had chanted there for more than an hour before coming to the airport in a caravan of cars. Now, many of them, also in response to Mukunda's flyer, stood with incense and flowers in their hands. As the disembarking passengers entered the terminal gate and walked up the ramp, they looked in amazement at the reception party of flower-bearing chanters. The chanters, however, gazed past these ordinary tired-looking travelers, searching for that special person who was supposed to be on the plane. Suddenly, strolling among them and toward them was the Swamiji, golden complexion, dressed in bright saffron robes. Prabhupada had heard the chanting even before he had entered the terminal, and he had begun to smile. He was happy and surprised. Glancing over the faces, he recognized only a few, yet here were 50 people receiving him and chanting Hare Krishna. Without his having said a word, Mukunda says, "We just had a look at Swamiji, and then we bowed down, myself, my wife, and the friends I had brought, Sam and Marjorie, and then all of the young men and women. They all followed suit and bowed down to Swamiji, just feeling very confident that it was the right and proper thing to do." The crowd of hippies had formed a line on either side of a narrow passage through which Swamiji would walk. As he passed among his new admirers, dozens of hands stretched out to offer him flowers and incense. He smiled, collecting the offerings in his hands while Ranchar looked on. Allen Ginsberg stepped forward with a large bouquet of flowers, and Srila Prabhupada graciously accepted it. Then Prabhupada began offering the gifts back to all who reached out to receive them. He proceeded through the terminal, the crowd of young people walking beside him chanting. At the baggage plane, Srila Prabhupada waited for a moment, his eyes taking in everyone around him. Lifting his open palms, he beckoned everyone to chant louder, and the group burst into renewed chanting, with Prabhupada standing in their midst, softly clapping his hands and singing Hare Krishna. Gracefully he listened, raised his arms above his head, and began to dance, stepping and swaying from side to side. To the mixed chagrin, amusement, and irresistible joy of the airport workers and passengers, the reception party stayed with Prabhupada until he got his luggage. Then they escorted him outside into the sunlight and into a waiting car, a black 1949 Cadillac Fleetwood. Prabhupada got into the back seat with Mukunda and Allen Ginsberg. Until the moment the car pulled away from the curve, Srila Prabhupada, still smiling, continued handing flowers to all those who had come to welcome him as he brought Krishna consciousness west. The Cadillac belonged to Harvey Cohen, who almost a year before had allowed Prabhupada to stay in his Bowery loft. Harvey was driving, but because of his chauffeur's hat, picked up at a Salvation Army store, and his black suit and his beard, Prabhupada didn't recognize him. "Where is Harvey?" Prabhupada asked. "He's driving," Mukunda said. "Oh, is that you? I didn't recognize you." Harvey smiled. "Welcome to San Francisco, Swamiji." Srila Prabhupada was happy to be in another big Western city on behalf of his spiritual master, Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati, and Lord Chaitanya. The further west one goes, Lord Chaitanya had said, the more materialistic the people. Yet Lord Chaitanya had also said that Krishna consciousness should spread all over the world. Prabhupada's godbrothers had often wondered about Lord Chaitanya's statement that one day the name of Krishna would be sung in every town and village. Perhaps that verse should be taken symbolically, they said. Otherwise, what could it mean? Krishna in every town? But Srila Prabhupada had deep faith in that statement by Lord Chaitanya and in the instruction of his spiritual master. Here he was in the far western city of San Francisco, and already people were chanting. They had enthusiastically received him with flowers and kirtan. And all over the world, there were other cities much like this one. The temple Mukunda and his friends had obtained was on Frederick Street in the Haight-Ashbury district. Like the temple at 26 Second Avenue in New York Street, a sign over the window read, Sri Sri Radha Krishna Temple. Mukunda and his friends had also rented a 3-room apartment for Swamiji on the 3rd floor of the adjoining building. It was a small, bare, rundown apartment facing the street. Followed by several carloads of devotees and curious seekers, Srila Prabhupada arrived at 518 Frederick Street and entered the storefront, which was decorated only by a few madras cloths on the wall. Taking his seat on a cushion, he led a kirtan and then spoke, inviting everyone to take up Krishna consciousness. After his lecture, he left the storefront and walked next door and up the 2 flights of stairs to his apartment. As he entered his apartment, number 32, he was followed not only by his devotees and admirers, but also by reporters from San Francisco's main newspaper, the Chronicle, and the Examiner. While some devotees cooked his lunch and Ranchor unpacked his suitcase, Swamiji talked with the reporters who sat on the floor taking notes on their pads. Reporter, downstairs you said you were inviting everyone to Krishna consciousness. Does that include the Haight-Ashbury Bohemians and beatniks? Srila Prabhupada, yes, everyone, including you or anybody else, be he or she what is called an acid head or a hippie or something else. But once he is accepted for training, he becomes something else from what he'd been before. Reporter, what does one have to do to become a member of your movement? Prabhupada, there are 4 prerequisites. I do not allow my students to keep girlfriends. I prohibit all kinds of intoxicants, including coffee, tea, and cigarettes. I prohibit meat eating, and I prohibit my students from taking part in gambling. Reporter, do these shall not commandments extend to the use of LSD, marijuana, and other narcotics? Srila Prabhupada, yeah, I consider LSD to be an intoxicant. I do not allow any one of my students to use that or any intoxicant. I train my students to rise early in the morning, to take a bath early in the day, and to attend prayer meetings 3 times a day. Our sect is one of austerity. It is the science of God. Although Prabhupada had found that reporters generally did not report his philosophy, he took the opportunity to preach Krishna consciousness. Even if the reporters didn't want to delve into the philosophy, his followers did. The big mistake of modern civilization, Srila Prabhupada continued, is to encroach upon others' property as though it were one's own. This creates an unnatural disturbance. God is the ultimate proprietor of everything in the universe. When people know that God is the ultimate proprietor, the best friend of all living entities, and the object of all offerings and sacrifices, then there will be peace. The reporters asked him about his background. He told briefly about his coming from India and beginning in New York. After the reporters left, Prabhupada continued speaking to the young people in his room. Mukunda, who had allowed his hair and beard to grow, but who wore around his neck a strand of large red beads Swamiji had given him at initiation, introduced some of his friends and explained that they were all living together and that they wanted to help Swamiji present Krishna consciousness to the young people of San Francisco. Mukunda's wife Janaki asked Swamiji about his plane ride. He said it had been pleasant except for some pressure in his ears. The houses looked like matchboxes, he said. With his thumb and forefinger, he indicated the size of a matchbox. He leaned back against the wall and took off the garlands he had received that day until only a beaded necklace, a common inexpensive item with a small bell on it, remained hanging around his neck. Prabhupada held it, inspected the workmanship, and toyed with it. This is special, he said, looking up, because it was made with devotion. He continued to pay attention to the necklace as if receiving it had been one of the most important events of the day. When his lunch arrived, he distributed some to everyone, and then Ranchor efficiently, though tactlessly, asked everyone to leave and give the Swami a little time to eat and rest. Outside the apartment and in the storefront below, the talk was of Swamiji. No one had been disappointed. Everything Mukunda had been telling them about him was true. They particularly enjoyed how he had talked about seeing everything from Krishna's viewpoint. That night on television, Swamiji's arrival was covered on the 11 o'clock news, and the next day it appeared in the newspapers. The Examiner story was on page 2. Swami arrives, Swami invites the hippies, along with a photo of the temple filled with followers, and some shots of Swamiji who looked very grave. Prabhupada had Mukunda read the article aloud. The lanky master of the faith, Mukunda read, attired in a flowing ankle-long robe and sitting cross-legged on a big mattress. Swamiji interrupted. What is this word lanky? Mukunda explained it meant tall and slender. I don't know why they said that, he added. Maybe it's because you sit so straight and tall, so they think you are very tall. The article went on to describe many of the airport greeters as being of the long-haired, bearded, and sandaled set. San Francisco's largest paper, the Chronicle, also ran an article. Swami in Hippie Land, holy man opens SF temple. The article began, a holy man from India described by his friend and beat poet Allen Ginsberg as one of the more conservative leaders of his faith, launched a kind of evangelistic effort yesterday in the heart of San Francisco's hippie haven. Śrila Prabhupada objected to be called conservative. He was indignant. Conservative? How is that? In respect to sex and drugs, Mukunda suggested. Of course, we are conservative in that sense, Prabhupada said. That simply means we are following Shastra. We cannot depart from Bhagavad Gita, but conservative we are not. Chaitanya Mahaprabhu was so strict, he would not even look on a woman. But we are accepting everyone into this movement, regardless of sex, caste, position, or whatever. Everyone is invited to come chant Hare Krishna. This is Chaitanya Mahaprabhu's munificence, his liberality. No, we are not conservative. Śrila Prabhupada rose from bed and turned on the light. It was 1 a.m., although the alarm had not sounded, and no one had come to awaken him. He had risen on his own. The apartment was cold and quiet. Wrapping his chadar around his shoulders, he sat quietly at his makeshift desk, a trunk filled with manuscripts, and in deep concentration, chanted the Hare Krishna mantra on his beads. After an hour of chanting, Śrila Prabhupada turned to his writing. Although 2 years had passed since he had published the book, the third and final volume of the first canto of Srimad Bhagavatam, he had daily been working, sometimes on his translation and commentary on the second canto, but mostly on Bhagavad Gita. In the 1940s in India, he had written an entire Bhagavad Gita translation and commentary, but his only copy had mysteriously disappeared. Then in 1965, after a few months in America, he had begun again, starting with the introduction, which he had composed in his room on 72nd Street in New York. Now, thousands of manuscript pages filled his trunk, completing his Bhagavad Gita. If his New York disciple Hayagriva, formerly an English professor, could edit it, and if some other disciples could get it published, it would be an important achievement. But publishing books in America seemed difficult, more difficult than in India. Even though in India he had been alone, he had managed to publish 3 volumes in 3 years. Here in America, he had many followers, but many followers meant increased responsibilities. And none of his followers as yet seemed seriously inclined to take up typing, editing, and dealing with American businessmen. Yet despite the dim prospects for publishing his Bhagavad Gita, Śrila Prabhupada had begun translating another book, Chaitanya Charitamrita, the principal Vaishnava scripture on the life and teachings of Lord Chaitanya. Putting on his reading glasses, Prabhupada opened his books and turned on the dictating machine. He studied the Bengali and Sanskrit texts, then picked up the microphone, flicked the switch to record, flashing on a small red light, and began speaking. While the Lord was going, chanting and dancing, he spoke more than a phrase at a time, flicking the switch, pausing, and then dictating again. Thousands of people were following him, and some of them were laughing and dancing, and some singing. Some of them were falling on the ground, offering obeisances to the Lord. Speaking and pausing, flicking the switch on and off, he would sit straight, sometimes gently rocking and nodding his head as he urged forward his words. Or he would bend low over his books, carefully studying them through his reading glasses. An hour passed and Prabhupada worked on. The building was dark except for Prabhupada's lamp and quiet except for the sound of his voice and the click and hum of the dictating machine. He wore a faded peach turtleneck jersey beneath his gray wool chador, and since he had just risen from bed, his saffron dhoti was wrinkled. Without having washed his face or gone to the bathroom, he sat absorbed in his work. At least for these few rare hours, the street and Radha Krishna temple were quiet. The situation with the dark night, the surrounding quiet, and him and his transcendental literary work was not much different from his early morning hours in his room at the Radha Damodar temple in Vrindavan, India. There, of course, he had no dictating machine, but he had worked during the same hours and from the same text, Chaitanya Charitamrita. Once he had begun a verse-by-verse translation with commentary, and another time he had written essays on the text. Now, having just arrived in this corner of the world, so remote from the scenes of Lord Chaitanya's pastimes, he was beginning the first chapter of the new English version of Chaitanya Charitamrita. He called it Teachings of Lord Chaitanya. He was following what had become a vital routine in his life, rising early and writing the Parampara message of Krishna consciousness, putting aside all other considerations, disregarding present circumstances. He emerged into the timeless message of transcendental knowledge. This was his most important service to Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati. The thought of producing more books and distributing them widely inspired her to rise every night and translate. Prabhupada worked until dawn. Then he stopped and prepared himself to go down to the temple for morning meeting. Though some of the New York disciples had objected, Śrila Prabhupada was still scheduled for the mantra rock dance at the Avalon Ballroom. It wasn't proper, they had said, for the devotees out in San Francisco to ask their spiritual master to go to such a place. It would mean amplified guitars, pounding drums, wild light shows, and hundreds of drugged hippies. How could his pure message be heard in such a place? But in San Francisco, Mukunda and others had been working on the mantra rock dance for months. It would draw thousands of young people, and the San Francisco Radha Krishna temple stood to make thousands of dollars. So although among his New York disciples, Śrila Prabhupada had expressed uncertainty, he now said nothing to deter the enthusiasm of his San Francisco followers. Sam Spearstra, Mukunda's friend and one of the mantra rock organizers, explained the idea to Hari Griva, who had just arrived from New York. There's a whole new school of San Francisco music opening up. The Grateful Dead have already cut their first record. Their offer to do this dance is a great publicity boost just when we need it. But Swamiji says that even Ravi Shankar is Maya, Hari Griva said. Oh, it's all been arranged, Sam assured him. All the bands will be on stage, and Allen Ginsberg will introduce Swamiji to San Francisco. Swamiji will talk and then chant Hare Krishna, with the bands joining in. Then he leaves. There should be around 4,000 people there. Śrila Prabhupada knew he would not compromise himself. He would go, chant, then leave. The important thing was to spread the chanting of Hare Krishna. If thousands of young people gathering to hear rock music could be engaged in hearing and chanting the names of God, then what was the harm? As a preacher, Prabhupada was prepared to go anywhere to spread Krishna consciousness. Since chanting Hare Krishna was absolute, one who heard or chanted the names of Krishna, anyone, anywhere, in any condition, could be saved from falling to the lower species in the next life. These young hippies wanted something spiritual, but they had no direction. They were confused, accepting hallucinations as spiritual visions, but they were seeking genuine spiritual life, just like many of the young people on the Lower East Side. Prabhupada decided he would go. His disciples wanted him to, and he was their servant and the servant of Lord Chaitanya. Mukunda, Sam, and Haravi Cohen had already met with the rock entrepreneur Chet Helms, who had agreed they could use his Avalon ballroom, and if they could get the bands to come, everything above the cost for the groups, the security and a few other basics, would go as profit for the San Francisco Radha Krishna Temple. Mukunda and Sam had then gone calling on the music groups, most who lived in the Bay Area, and one after another, the exciting new San Francisco rock bands, the Grateful Dead, Moby Grape, Big Brother and the Holding Company, Jefferson Airplane, Quicksilver Messenger Service, had agreed to appear with Swami Bhaktivedanta for the minimum wage of $250 per group. And Allen Ginsberg had agreed. The lineup was complete. In San Francisco, every rock concert had an art poster, many of them designed by the psychedelic artist called Mouse. One thing about Mouse's posters was that it was difficult to tell where the letters left off and the background began. He used dissonant colors and made his posters seem to flash on and off. Borrowing from this tradition, Harvey Cohen had created a unique poster, Krishna Consciousness Comes West, using red and blue concentric circles and a candid photo of Swamiji smiling in Tompkins Square Park. The devotees put the posters up all over town. Hayagriva and Mukunda went to discuss the program for the mantra rock dance with Allen Ginsberg. Allen was already well known as an advocate of the Hare Krishna mantra. In fact, acquaintances would often greet him with Hare Krishna when he walked on Haight Street. And he was known to visit and recommend that others visit the Radha Krishna temple. Hayagriva, whose full beard and long hair rivaled Allen's, was concerned about the melody Allen would use when he chanted with Swamiji. I think the melody used, Hayagriva said, it is too difficult for good chanting. Maybe, Allen admitted, but that's the melody I first heard in India. A wonderful lady saint was chanting it. I'm quite accustomed to it, and it's the only one I can sing convincingly. With only a few days remaining before the mantra rock dance, Allen came to an early morning kirtan at the temple and later joined Śrila Prabhupada upstairs in his room. A few devotees were sitting with Prabhupada eating Indian sweets when Allen came through the door. He and Prabhupada smiled and exchanged greetings, and Prabhupada offered him a sweet, remarking that Mr. Ginsberg was up very early. Yes, Allen replied, the phone hasn't stopped ringing since I arrived in San Francisco. This is what happens when one becomes famous, said Prabhupada. That was the tragedy of Mahatma Gandhi also. Wherever he went, thousands of people would crowd about him, chanting, Mahatma Gandhi ki jai, Mahatma Gandhi ki jai. The gentleman could not sleep. Well, at least it got me up for kirtan this morning, said Allen. Yes, that is good. The conversation turned to the upcoming program at the Avalon Ballroom. Don't you think there's a possibility of chanting a tune that would be more appealing to Western ears? Allen asked. Any tune will do, said Prabhupada. Melody is not important. What is important is that you will chant Hare Krishna. It can be the tune of your own country. That doesn't matter. Prabhupada and Allen also talked about the meaning of the word hippie. And Allen mentioned something about taking LSD. Prabhupada replied that LSD created dependence. It was not necessary for a person in Krishna consciousness. Krishna consciousness resolves everything, Prabhupada said. Nothing else is needed. At the mantra rock dance, there would be a multimedia light show by the biggest names in the art, Ben Van Meter and Roger Hilliard. Ben and Roger were expert at using simultaneous strobe lights, films, and slideshows to fill an auditorium with optical effects reminiscent of LSD visions. Mukunda had given them many slides of Krishna to use during the kirtan. One evening, Ben and Roger came to see the Swamiji in his apartment. Roger Hilliard. He was great. I was really impressed. It wasn't the way he looked, the way he acted or the way he dressed, but it was his total being. Swamiji was very serene and very humorous, and at the same time, obviously very wise and in tune, enlightened. He had the ability to relate to a lot of different kinds of people. I was thinking some of this must be really strange for this person to come to the United States and end up in the middle of Haight-Ashbury with a storefront for an ashram and a lot of very strange people around. And yet he was totally right there with everybody. On the night of the mantra rock dance, while the stage crew set up equipment and tested the sound system, and Ben and Roger organized their light show upstairs, Mukunda and the others collected tickets at the door. People lined up all the way down the street and around the block waiting for tickets at $2.50 apiece. Attendance would be good, a capacity crowd, and most of the local luminaries were coming. LSD pioneer Timothy Leary arrived and was given a special seat on stage. Swami Kriyananda came, carrying a tambura. A man wearing a top hat and a suit with a silk sash that said San Francisco arrived, claiming to be the mayor. At the door, Mukunda stopped a respectably dressed young man who didn't have a ticket, but then someone tapped Mukunda on the shoulder. Let him in. It's all right. He's Osley. Mukunda apologized and submitted, allowing Augustus Osley Stanley II, folk hero and famous synthesizer of LSD, to enter without a ticket. Almost everyone who came wore bright or unusual costumes, tribal robes, Mexican ponchos, Indian kurtas, God's eyes, feathers, and beads. Some hippies brought their own flutes, lutes, gourds, drums, rattles, horns, and guitars. The Hell's Angels, dirty haired, wearing jeans, boots, and denim jackets, and accompanied by their women, made their entrance carrying chains, smoking cigarettes, and displaying their regalia of German helmets and blazoned emblems and so on. Everything but their motorcycles, which they had parked outside. The devotees began a warm-up kirtan on stage, dancing the way Swamiji had shown them. Incense poured from the stage and from the corners of the large ballroom. And although most in the audience were high on drugs, the atmosphere was calm. They had come seeking a spiritual experience. As the chanting began, very melodiously, some of the musicians took part by playing their instruments. The light show began, strobe lights flashed, colored balls bounced back and forth to the beat of the music, large blobs of pulsing colors splurted across the floor, walls, and ceiling. After 8 o'clock, Moby Grape took the stage. With heavy electric guitars, electric bass, and two bass, and two drummers, they launched into their first number. The large speakers shook the ballroom with their vibrations, and a roar of approval rose from the audience. Around 9:30, Prabhupada left his Frederick Street apartment and got into the back seat of Ari's Cadillac. He was dressed in his usual saffron robes, and around his neck he wore a garland of gardenias, whose sweet aroma filled the car. On the way to the Avalon, he talked about the need to open more centers. At 10 o'clock, Prabhupada walked up the stairs of the Avalon, followed by Kirtananda and Ranchor. As he entered the ballroom, devotees blew conch shells, someone began a drum roll, and the crowd parted down the center all the way from the entrance to the stage, opening a path for him to walk. With his head held high, Prabhupada seemed to float by as he walked through the strange milieu, making his way across the ballroom floor to the stage. Suddenly, the light show changed. Pictures of Krishna and his pastimes flashed onto the wall. Krishna and Arjuna riding together on Arjuna's chariot. Krishna eating butter. Krishna subduing the whirlwind demon. Krishna playing the flute. As Prabhupada walked through the crowd, everyone stood applauding and cheering. He climbed the stairs and seated himself softly on a waiting cushion. The crowd quieted. Looking over at Allen Ginsberg, Prabhupada said, "You can speak something about the mantra." Allen began to tell of his understanding and experience with the Hare Krishna mantra. He told how Swamiji had opened a storefront on 2nd Avenue and had chanted Hare Krishna in Tompkins Square Park, and he invited everyone to the Frederick Street Temple. "I especially recommend the early morning kirtans," he said, "for those who, coming down from LSD, want to stabilize their consciousness on re-entry." Prabhupada spoke, giving a brief history of the mantra. Then he looked over at Alan again. "You may chant." Alan began playing his harmonium and chanting into the microphone, singing the tune he had brought from India. Gradually, more and more people in the audience caught on and began chanting. As the kirtan continued and the audience got increasingly enthusiastic, musicians from various bands came on stage to join in. Ranchar, a fair drummer, began playing Moby Grape's drums. Some of the bass and other guitar players joined in as the devotees and large group of hippies mounted the stage. The multicolored oil slicks pulsed and the ball bounced back and forth to the beat of the mantra, now projected on the wall. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. As the chanting spread throughout the hall, some of the hippies got to their feet, held hands, and danced. Allen Ginsberg. We sang Hare Krishna all evening. It was absolutely great, an open thing. It was the height of the Haight-Ashbury spiritual enthusiasm. It was the first time that there had been a music scene in San Francisco where everybody could be part of it and participate. Everybody could sing and dance rather than listen to other people sing and dance. Janaki. People didn't know what they were chanting for, but to see that many people chanting, even though most of them were intoxicated, made Swamiji very happy. He loved to see the people chanting. I agree with him. Standing in front of the bands, I could hear hardly at all, but above all, I could make out the chanting of Hare Krishna building steadily. On the wall behind, a slide projected a huge picture of Krishna in a golden helmet with a peacock feather, a flute in his hand. Then Srila Prabhupada stood up, lifted his arms, and began to dance. He gestured for everyone to join him, and those who were still seated stood up and began dancing and chanting and swaying back and forth, following Prabhupada's gentle dance. Roger Siegel. The ballroom appeared as if it was a human field of wheat blowing in the wind. It produced a calm feeling in contrast to the Avalon ballroom atmosphere of gyrating energies. The chanting of Hare Krishna continued for over an hour, and finally, everyone was jumping and yelling, even crying and shouting. Someone placed a microphone before Srila Prabhupada, and his voice resounded strongly over the powerful sound system. The tempo quickened, and Srila Prabhupada was perspiring profusely. Kirtananda insisted that the kirtan stop. Swamiji was too old for this, he said. It might be harmful. But the chanting continued faster and faster until the words of the mantra finally became indistinguishable amidst the amplified music in the chorus of thousands of voices. Then suddenly it ended, and all that could be heard was the loud hum of the amplifiers and Srila Prabhupada's voice ringing out, offering obeisances to his spiritual master. Om Vishnu Pad Paramaham Parvajakacharya Astat Taratata Shri Srimad Bhakti Siddhanta Saraswati Maharaj Prabhupada. Ki! All glories to the assembled devotees. Srila Prabhupada made his way off stage through the heavy smoke and crowds and down the front stairs with Kirtananda and Ranchar close behind him. Alan then announced the next rock group. As Swamiji left the ballroom, the appreciative crowd behind him, he commented, "This is no place for a brahmachari." The next morning, the temple was crowded with young people who had seen Swamiji at the Avalon. Most of them stayed up all night. Srila Prabhupada, having followed his usual morning schedule, came down at 7, held kirtan, and delivered the morning lecture. Later that morning, while riding to the beach with Kirtananda and Harigriva, Swamiji asked how many people had attended last night's kirtan. When they told him, he asked how much money they had made. They said they weren't sure, but it was approximately $1,500. Half audibly, he chanted in the back seat of the car, looking out the window, as quiet and unassuming as a child, with no indication that the night before he had been cheered and applauded by thousands of hippies who had stood back and made a grand aisle for him to walk in triumph across the strobe-lit floor amid the thunder of the electric basses and pounding drums of the Avalon ballroom. For all the fanfare of the night before, he remained untouched, the same as ever in personal demeanor. He was aloof, innocent, and humble, while at the same time appearing very grave and ancient. As Kirtananda and Harigriva were aware, Swamiji was not of this world. They knew that he, unlike them, was always thinking of Krishna. They walked with him along the boardwalk near the ocean, with its cool breezes and cresting waves. Kirtananda spread the chadar over Prabhupada's shoulders. In Bengali, there is one nice verse, Prabhupada remarked, breaking his silence. I remember. Oh, what is that voice across the sea calling, come here, come here. Speaking little, he walked the boardwalk with his two friends, frequently looking out at the sky and sea. As he walked, he softly sang a mantra that Kirtananda and Hayagriva had never heard before. Govinda Jaya Jaya, Gopala Jaya Jaya, Radha Hari Govinda Jaya. He sang slowly in a deep voice as they walked along the boardwalk. He looked out at the Pacific Ocean because it is great, it is tranquil. The ocean seems to be eternal. Hayagriva ventured. No, Prabhupada replied, nothing in the material world is eternal. In New York, since there were so few women present at the temple, people had inquired whether it was possible for a woman to join the Krishna consciousness movement. But in San Francisco, that question never arose. Most of the men who came to learn from Swamiji came with their girlfriends. To Prabhupada, these boys and girls, eager for chanting and hearing about Krishna, were like sparks of faith to be fanned into steady blazing fires of devotional life. There was no question of his asking newcomers to give up their girlfriends or boyfriends, and yet he uncompromisingly preached no illicit sex. The dilemma, however, seemed to have an obvious solution: marry the couples in Krishna consciousness. Because traditionally a sannyasi would never arrange or perform marriages by Indian standards, someone might criticize Prabhupada for allowing any mingling of the sexes. But Prabhupada gave priority to spreading Krishna consciousness. What Indian, however critical, had ever tried to transplant the essence of India's spiritual culture into the Western culture? Prabhupada saw that to change the American social system and completely separate the men from the women would not be possible. But to compromise this standard of no illicit sex was also not possible. Therefore, Krishna conscious married life, the Grahastha ashram, would be the best arrangement for many of his new aspiring disciples. In Krishna consciousness, husband and wife could live together and help one another in spiritual progress. It was an authorized arrangement for allowing a man and woman to associate. If, as spiritual master, he found it necessary to perform marriages himself, he would do it. But first, these young couples would have to become attracted to Krishna consciousness. Joan Campanella had grown up in a wealthy suburb of Portland, Oregon, where her father was a corporate tax attorney. She and her sister had their own sports cars, their own boats for sailing on Lake Oswego. Disgusted by the sorority life at the University of Oregon, Joan had dropped out during her first term and enrolled at Reed College, where she had studied ceramics, weaving, and calligraphy. In 1963, she had moved to San Francisco to become the co-owner of a ceramics shop. Although she had many friends among fashionable shopkeepers, folk singers, and dancers, she had remained aloof and introspective. It was through her sister Jan that Joan had first met Śrila Prabhupada. Jan had gone with her boyfriend, Michael Grant, to live in New York City, where Michael had worked as a music arranger. In 1965, they had met Swamiji while he was living alone on the Bowery, and they had become his initiated disciples, Mukunda and Janaki. Swamiji had asked them to get married, and they had invited Joan to the wedding. As a wedding guest for one day, Joan had then briefly entered Swamiji's transcendental world at 26 Second Avenue, and he had kept her busy all day making dough and filling kachori pastries for the wedding feast. Joan had worked in one room, and Swamiji had worked in the kitchen, although he had repeatedly come in and guided her in making the kachuris properly, telling her not to touch her clothes or body while cooking, and instructing her not to smoke cigarettes because the food was to be offered to Lord Krishna and therefore had to be prepared purely. Joan had been convinced by this brief association that Swamiji was a great spiritual teacher, but she had returned to San Francisco without pursuing Krishna consciousness further. A few months later, Mukunda and Janaki had driven to the West Coast with plans of going soon to India, but had changed their plans when Mukunda had received a letter from Swamiji asking him to try to start a Krishna conscious temple in California. Mukund had talked about Swamiji to Joan and her other friends, and he had found that a lot of young people were interested. Joan had then accompanied Mukunda, Janaki, and a boy named Roger Siegel to the mountains in Oregon, where they had visited their mutual friends, Sam and Marjorie, who had been living in a forest lookout tower. Mukunda had explained what he had known of Krishna consciousness, and the six of them had begun chanting Hare Krishna together. They had been especially interested in Swamiji's teaching about elevating consciousness without drugs. Mukunda had talked excitedly about Swamiji's having asked him to start a temple in California. And soon he and his wife Janaki, Sam and his girlfriend Marjorie, and Roger and Joan, now intimate friends, had moved to an apartment in San Francisco to find a storefront and set the stage for Swamiji. After Swamiji's arrival, Joan had begun attending the temple kirtans. She felt drawn to Swamiji and the chanting, and she especially liked the informal visiting hours. Swamiji would sit in his rocking chair with his hand in his bead bag, chanting the holy names, and Joan would sit fascinated, watching his fingers moving within the bag. One day, during Swamiji's visiting hours, while Swamiji was sitting in his rocking chair and Joan and others were sitting at his feet, Janaki's cat crept in through the hallway door and began slowly coming down the hallway. The cat came closer and closer and slowly meandering right in front of Swamiji's feet. It sat down, looking up intently at Swamiji, and began to meow. None of the devotees knew what to expect. Swamiji began gently stroking the back of the cat with his foot, saying, Hare Krishna, are you feeding him prasadam milk? So, I was touched by Swamiji's activities and kindness, even to cats, and I longed for more association with him. Joan came to understand that serving Swamiji was a serious matter, but she didn't want to jump into initiation until she was 100% sure about it. Sometimes she would cry in ecstasy, and sometimes she would fall asleep during Swamiji's lecture. So she remained hesitant and skeptical, wondering, how can I actually apply Swamiji's teachings to my life? One evening, Swamiji asked her, when are you going to be initiated? Joan said that she didn't know, but she relished reading his books and chanting Hare Krishna. She said that because she was attracted to the mountains and to elevated spiritual consciousness, she wanted to travel to Tibet. Swamiji, sitting in his rocking chair, looked down at Jen as she sat at his feet. She felt he was looking right through her. I can take you to a higher place than Tibet, he said. Just see. Suddenly, Joan felt that Swami knew everything about her, and she understood. Oh, I have to see through his eyes what Krishna consciousness is. He was promising that he would take her to some very elevated realm, but she would have to see it. It was then that Joan decided to become Swamiji's disciple. When she and her boyfriend Roger, he was astounded. He and Joan had been coming to kirtans and lectures together, but he still had doubts. Maybe it would be good for him and Joan to get married, but not initiated. Joan, however, was more determined. She explained to Roger that Swamiji hadn't come just to perform marriages. He had to get initiated first. Roger Siegel had grown up in New York. He was following a Hatha Yoga guru, had experimented with psychedelic chemicals, and had traveled in the Deep South as a civil rights activist, taking part in freedom marches with the Blacks. Large-bodied, sociable, and outgoing, he had lots of friends in San Francisco. At the airport, a merry mood with Haight-Ashbury crowd, he had seen Swamiji the first time and been especially struck by Swamiji's regal bearing and the absence of self-consciousness. The concept of reincarnation had always intrigued him, but after attending some of the Swamiji's lectures and hearing him explain transmigration of the soul, he felt he had found someone who definitely knew the answer to any question about life and death. One night, after attending the program at the temple, Roger returned to his apartment and sat down on the fire escape to meditate on what Swamiji had said. The world is false, he said, but it feels real to me. Roger thought, if I pinch my arm, I feel pain. So how is that illusion? This fire escape is real. Otherwise, I would be falling in space. This space is real, isn't it? Roger decided he didn't understand what Swamiji meant by illusion. If I try to walk through the wall, he thought, would that be real or not? Maybe the wall's reality is just in my mind. To test the illusion, he went inside his apartment, concentrated his mind, and walked against the wall. Smack. He sat down again and thought, what does Swamiji mean when he says the world is illusion? He decided he should ask at the next meeting. He did. And Śrila Prabhupada told him that actually the world is real because it was created by God, the supreme reality. But it is unreal in the sense that everything material is temporary. When a person takes the temporary world to be permanent and all in all, he is in illusion. Only the spiritual world, Swamiji explained, is eternal and therefore real. Roger was satisfied by the Swamiji's answer, but he had other difficulties. He thought Swamiji was too conservative. Then Swamiji said that people's dogs must be kept outside the temple. Roger didn't like it. Many visitors brought pet dogs with them to the temple, and now there was a hitching post in front of the building just to accommodate the pets on leashes. But Swamiji wouldn't allow pets inside. This philosophy is for humans, he said. A cat or dog cannot understand it. Although if he hears the chanting of Hare Krishna, he can receive a higher birth in the future.
Thank you. Jai Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhar Shivasadi Gaur Bhakta Vrinda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Ram 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 Hare Hare. Rajas also had other points of contention with what he considered Swamiji's conservative philosophy. Swamiji repeatedly spoke against uncontrolled habits like smoking, but Rogers couldn't imagine giving up such things. And the instructions about restricting sex life especially bothered him. Yet, despite his not following very strictly, Roger felt himself developing a love for Swamiji and Krishna. He sensed that Swamiji had much to teach him and that Swamiji was doing it in a certain way and a certain order. Rajers knew that Swamiji saw him as a baby in spiritual life who had to be spoon-fed. He knew he had to become submissive and accept whatever Swamiji gave him. Same Spirastra, tall and slender, with curly reddish gold hair, was athletic. He had trained as an Olympic skier, yet artistic. He was a writer and wood sculptor. He had graduated from Reed College in Oregon and gone on as a Fulbright scholar to a small college in Switzerland, where he had obtained in an MA in philosophy. He was popular as Mukunda saw him, the epitome of the rugged individualist. When Mukunda had visited Sam at his mountain lookout tower and told him about Swamiji and Krishna consciousness, Sam had been intrigued by the new ideas. Sam's life had nearly reached a dead end, but he had seen hope in what Mukunda and Janki had been saying about Swamiji. After spending only a few days with Mukunda, Sam had been eager to help him establish a temple of Krishna consciousness in San Francisco. Sam was the one who knew the local rock stars and had persuaded them to appear at the Avalon with Swami Bhaktivedanta, whom he had never met. Sam had seen Swamiji's for the first time when Swamiji had arrived at the San Francisco airport. And Sam had later insisted that he had seen a flash of light come from Swamiji's body. At first, Sam had been afraid to say anything, nor had he known what to say. Prabhupada was completely new to him and seemed to elevate it. But the day after the program at the Avalon, when Mukunda told Prabhupada that Sam had arranged the dance, Prabhupada sent for him to find out how much money they had made. Sitting across from Prabhupada, who sat behind his small desk, Sam informed him that they had made about $1,500 profit. Well then, Srila Prabhupada said, you will be the treasurer. Then Srila Prabhupada asked him, what is your idea of God? God is one, Sam replied. Prabhupada asked, what is the purpose of worshipping God? Sam replied, to become one with God. No, Prabhupada said, you cannot become one with God. God and you are always two different individuals, but you can become one in interest with him. And then he told Sam about Krishna. After they talked, Prabhupada said, you can come up every day and I will teach you how to do books. So Sam began meeting with Prabhupada for half an hour a day to learn bookkeeping. Sam, I had never been very good at keeping books and I really didn't want to do it, but it was a good excuse to come and see Swamiji every day. He would chew me out when I would spend too much money or when I couldn't balance the books properly. I really loved the idea that he was so practical that he knew bookkeeping. He became so much more of a friend from the beginning rather than some idealized person from another sphere of life. I took almost my practical questions to him. I learned to answer things for myself based on the way Swamiji always answered day-to-day problems. And the first thing he made me do was to get married to my girlfriend. Mukunda and his wife Janaki, whose apartment was just down the hall from Srila Prabhupada's, were the only couple Srila Prabhupada had already initiated and married. Mukunda, who often wore his strand of large red japa beads in two loose loops around his neck, had grown long hair and a short, thick black beard since coming to San Francisco. He had entered the summer of love, spirit of Haight-Ashbury, and was acquainted with many of the popular figures. Although occasionally earning money as a musician, he spent most of his time promoting Prabhupada's mission, especially by meeting people to arrange gala programs like the one at the Avalon. He was a leader in bringing people to assist Prabhupada. Yet he had no permanent sense of commitment. He was helping because it was fun, having little desire to be different from his many San Francisco friends. He did not strictly follow Prabhupada's principle for regulated spiritual life. In his exchange with Srila Prabhupada, Mukunda liked to assume a posture of fraternal camaraderie rather than one of menial servitude. And Srila Prabhupada reciprocated sometimes. However, Prabhupada would assert himself as a teacher. Once when Prabhupada walked into Mukunda's apartment, he noticed a poster on the wall showing a matador with a cap and sword going after a bull. This is a horrible picture, Srila Prabhupada exclaimed, his face showing displeasure. Mukunda looked at the poster, realizing for the first time what it meant. Yet, yes, it is horrible, he said, and tore it off the wall. Srila Prabhupada was eager to have someone play the mridanga properly during the kirtans, and Mukunda, a musician, was likely candidate. Mukunda, the day the drum came, I asked Swamiji if I could learn, and he said yes. I asked him when, and he said, when do you want? Now? I asked, he said yes. I was a little surprised to get such a quick appointment, but I brought the drum to his room, and he began to show me the basic beat. First, there was a gi ta ta, gi ta ta, gi ta ta, and then one slightly more complicated beat, gi ta ta, gi ta ta, gi ta ta, gi ta. As I began to play the beat, I kept speeding it up, and he kept telling me to slow down. He spent a lot of time just showing me how to strike the heads of the drum. Then I finally began to get it a little. But he had to keep admonishing me to slow down and pronounce the syllables as I hit the drum. Gi, ta, ta. The syllables, he said, and the drum should sound the same. I should make it sound like that and always pronounce them. I was determined and played very slowly for a long time. Long time. I was concentrating with great intensity. Then suddenly I was aware of Swamiji standing motionless beside me. I didn't know how long he was going to stand there without saying anything, and I became a little uncomfortable. But I continued playing. When I got up, the courage to look up and see his face, to my surprise, he was moving his head back and forth in an affirming way with his eyes closed. He seemed to be enjoying the lesson. This came as a complete surprise to me. Although I, although I had taken music lessons before and had spent many years taking piano lessons, I can never remember an instance when the teacher seemed to actually enjoying my playing. I felt very wonderful to see that here was a teacher who was so perfect, who enjoyed what he was teaching so much, not because it was his personal teaching or his personal method, but because he was witnessing Krishna's energy pass through him to a conditioned soul like myself. And he was getting great pleasure out of it. I had a deeper realization that Swamiji was a real teacher, although I had no idea what a spiritual master really was. To Mukunda's wife, Janaki, Krishna consciousness meant dealing in a personal way with Swamiji. As long as he was around, she was all right. She enjoyed asking him questions, serving him, and learning from him how to cook. She didn't care much for studying the philosophy of Krishna consciousness, but she quickly developed an intense attraction for him. Janaki, there were a group of us sitting around in Swamiji's apartment, and I asked him if he had any children. He looked at me as if I had said something strange, and he said, "You are not my child?" I said, "Well, yes." And he said, "Are not all these my children?" And his answer was so quick that I never doubted that he seriously meant what he said. For several hours, each morning, Prabhupada showed Janaki, John, and others how to cook. One day in the kitchen, he noticed a kind of berry he had never tasted, and he asked Janaki what they were. She told him strawberries. He immediately popped up one into his mouth, saying, "That's very tasty." And he proceeded to eat another and another, exclaiming, "Very tasty." One time, Janki was making whipped cream when Prabhupada came into the kitchen and asked, "What is that?" She replied, "It's whipped cream. What is whipped cream? He asked. It's a cream, she replied. But when you beat it, it fluffs up into a more solid form. Although always adamant about kitchen rules, one of the most important being that no one could eat in the kitchen. Srila Prabhupada immediately dipped his finger into the whipped cream and tested it. That is yogurt, he said. It is light-hearted, reprimanding way that was her pleasure. Janki replied, no, Swamiji, it's whipped cream. Srila Prabhupada corrected her. No, it is yogurt. And again, he put his finger into it and tasted it, saying, it tastes very nice. Swamiji, had the most exciting dream. We were all on a planet of our very own, and everybody from Earth had come here. They had all become pure devotees, and they were all chanting. You were sitting on a very special chair high off the ground, and the whole earth was clapping and chanting Hare Krishna. Swamiji smiled and said, oh, that's such a lovely dream. Bonnie McDonald, age 19, and her boyfriend Gary McLaurie, 20, had both come to San Francisco from Austin, where they had been living together as students at the University of Texas. Bonnie was a slight fair blonde with a sweet southern drawl. She was born and raised in Southeast Texas in a Baptist family. In a high school, she had become agnostic, but later, while traveling in Europe and studying the religious art there and the architecture of the great cathedrals, she had concluded that these great artists couldn't have been completely wrong. Gary, the son of US Air Force officer, had been raised in Germany, Okinawa, and other places around the world before his family had settled in Texas. His dark hair and bushy brows gave him a scowling look, except when he smiled. He was one of the first students at the University of Texas to wear long hair and experiment with psychedelic drugs. While taking LSD together, he and Bonnie had become obsessed with the idea of going on a spiritual search. And without notifying their parents or school, they had driven to the West Coast in search of someone who could teach us about spiritual life. They had spent a few frustrating months searching through spiritual books and amongst spiritual groups in Haight-Ashbury. They had become vegetarians. Gary had started teaching himself to play electric guitar, while Bonnie had gone to Golden Gate Park every day to perform a self-styled Hatha Yoga meditation. But gradually they had become disillusioned and had felt themselves becoming degraded from drugs. When the disciple is ready, the guru will appear. They had read, and they had waited eagerly for the day when their guru would come. Although Bonnie had spent most of her time in the parks of San Francisco, one day she had been looking through a table full of magazines in a Haight-Ashbury had shocked when she had found a copy of Back to Godhead, the mime-grabbed journal produced by Srila Prabhupada's disciple in New York. She had been particularly attracted to Haigriva's article about Swamiji. The description of Swamiji's smile, his bright eyes, his pointy-toed shoes, and the things he said had given her a feeling that this might be the guru she had been looking for. And when she had learned that this same Swamiji had opened an ashrama in Haight-Ashbury, She had immediately started searching through the neighborhood until she had found the temple of Frederick Street. Before Bonnie and Gary met Swamiji, they had both been troubled. Gary was in anxiety about the threat of being drafted into the army, and both of them were disillusioned because they had not found the truth they had come to San Francisco to find. So, on meeting Srila Prabhupada in his room, they began to explain their situation. Bonnie, he was sitting in a rocking chair in his little apartment, and he looked at us like we were crazy, because we were, and said, "You come to my classes? Simply come to my classes every morning and every evening, and everything will be all right." That sounded to us like an unbelievable panacea. But because we were so bewildered, we agreed to it. I told him I had traveled all over Europe and he said, "Oh, you have traveled to so much?" And I said to him, "Yes, I have traveled so much. I have done so many things, but none of it ever made me happy." He was pleased with that statement. He said, "Yes, that is the problem." We began going to his morning lectures. For us, it was a long distance to get there at 7 in the morning, but we did it every morning with the conviction that this was what he had said to do, and we were going to do it. Then one day he asked us, "What do you do?" When we said that formally we had been art students at college, he told us to paint a picture of Krishna. Shortly after that, we asked to be initiated. John and Roger were soon initiated, receiving the names Yamuna and Gurudas. And the very next day, they were married. At their wedding ceremony, Swamiji presided, wearing a bulky garland of leaves and drawn flowers. He sat on a cushion on the temple floor, surrounded by his followers and paraphernalia for the sacrificial fire. Before him was the small mound of earth where he would later build the fire. He explained the meaning of Krishna conscious marriage and how husband and wife should assist one another to serve Sri Krishna, keeping him in the center. Swamiji had commented that he did not like the Western woman's dress, and at his request, Yamuna was dressed in a sari. Although Swamiji had called for ghee, clarified butter, as one of the sacrificial ingredients, the devotees, thinking ghee too costly, had substituted melted margarine. He had called for firewood also, and the devotee had supplied him the beads of a broken orange crate. Now, with Yamuna and Gurudas seated before him on the opposite side of the mound of earth, he picked up a small piece of a splintered orange crate, dipped into what was supposed to be ghee, and held it in the candle flame. So began the fire. The splinter flamed, sputtered, and went out. He picked up another splinter and moistened it in the melted margarine. But when he touched it to the flame, it made the same sweet sound and sputtered out. After trying unsuccessfully for 4 or 5 times, Swamiji looked up and said, "This marriage will have a very slow start." Yamuna began to cry. Bonnie and Gary were initiated just 2 weeks after they had met Swamiji. Bonnie's initiated name was Govinda Dasi and Gary's was Gaur Sundar. Although still dressed in blue jeans, even at that initiation, and not professing to know much of what was going on, they had confidence in Swamiji. They knew that their minds were still hazy from drugs, but they took their initiation seriously and became strict followers. Gaur Sundar threw out whatever marijuana he had, and Govinda Dasi began eating only food they had offered to Lord Shri Krishna. 2 weeks after their initiation, Swamiji conducted their marriage ceremonies. On the evening of the wedding, Govinda Dasi's father came from Texas, even though he objected to Krishna consciousness as radically un-American. Walking up to Srila Prabhupada's seat in the temple, Govinda Dasi's father asked, why do you have to change my daughter's name? Why does she have to have an Indian name? Prabhupada looked at him and then, with a mischievous gleam, looked at Mr. Patel, an Indian guest standing nearby with his family. You don't like Indians? He asked. Everyone who heard Swamiji laughed, except for Govinda Dasi's father, who replied, well, yeah, they are all right, but why does Bonnie have to have a different name? Because she has asked me to give her one. Srila Prabhupada replied, if you love her, you will be like what she likes. Your daughter is happy. Why do you object? The discussion ended there, and Govinda Dasi's father remained civil. Later, he enjoyed taking prasadam with his daughter and son-in-law. Govinda Dasi, Gaur-Sundara, and I set about reading the 3 volumes of Swamiji's Srimad Bhagavatam. And at the same time, Swamiji had told me to paint a large canvas of Radha and Krishna and a cow. So every day for the whole day I would paint, and Gaur Sundar would read out loud from the Srimad Bhagavatam, 1 volume after another. We did this continuously for 2 months. During this time, Swamiji also asked me to do a portrait of him standing before a background painting of Lord Chaitanya dancing. Swamiji wanted it so that Lord Chaitanya's foot would be touching his head. I tried. It was a pretty horrible painting, and yet he was happy with it. Prabhupada's thoughtful followers felt that some of the candidate for initiation did not intend to fulfill the exclusive lifelong commitment a disciple owes to his guru. Swamiji, they would say, some of these people come only for their initiation. We have never seen them before, and we never see them again. Srila Prabhupada replied that was the risk he had to take. One day in a lecture in the temple, he explained that although the reactions for a disciple's past sins are removed at initiation, the spiritual master remains responsible until the disciple is delivered from the material world. Therefore, he said, Lord Chaitanya warned that a guru should not accept many disciples. One night in the temple during the question and answer session, a big bearded fellow raised his hand and asked Prabhupada, can I become initiated? The brash public request annoyed some of Prabhupada's followers, but Prabhupada was serene. Yes, he replied, but first you must answer 2 questions. Who is Krishna? The boy thought for a moment and said, Krishna is God. Yes, Prabhupada replied, and you? And who are you? Again, the boy thought for a moment and then replied, I am the servant of God. Very good, Prabhupada said. Yes, you can be initiated tomorrow. Srila Prabhupada knew that it would be difficult for his Western disciple to stick to Krishna consciousness and attain the goal of pure devotional service. All their lives, they had the worst of training, and despite their nominal Christianity and philosophical searching, most of them knew nothing of the science of God. They did not even know that illicit sex and meat eating were wrong. Although when he told them, they accepted what he said and they freely chanted Hare Krishna. So how could he refuse them? Of course, whatever they would be able to persevere in Krishna consciousness despite the ever-present attractions of Maya would be seen in time. Some would fall, that was the human tendency, but some would not. At least those who sincerely followed his instructions to chant Hare Krishna and avoid sinful activities would be successful. He gave the example that a person could say that today's fresh food, if not properly used, would spoil in a few days. But if it is fresh now, so to say that in the future it will be misused and therefore spoil in only a surmise. Yes, in the future anyone could fall down. But Prabhupada took it as his responsibility to engage his disciples now. And he was giving them the method which, if followed, would protect them from ever falling down. Aside from Vedic standards, even by the standard of Swamiji's New York disciples, the devotees in San Francisco were not very strict. Some continued going to the donut shop, eating food without offering it to Krishna, and eating forbidden things like chocolate and commercial ice cream. Some even indulge in after kirtana cigarette breaks right outside the temple door. Some got initiated without knowing precisely what they had agreed to practice. Kirtananda, the mood in San Francisco was a lot more relaxed. The devotees liked to go to the corner and have their coffee and donuts. But Prabhupada loved the way so many people were coming, and he loved the program at the Avalon Ballroom. But there were two sides, those who strictly follow the rules and regulations and emphasized purity, and then those who were not so concerned about strictness, but who wanted to spread Krishna consciousness as widely as possible. Swamiji was so great that he embraced both groups. Michelle Wright, 21, had recently gotten out of the Marine Corps, and Nancy Grindle, 18, was fresh out of a high school. They had met in college in Los Angeles, feeling frustrated and in need of something tangible to which to dedicate their lives. They had come to San Francisco to join the hippies, but they soon realized that they and the Haight-Ashbury hippies, whom they found dirty, aimless, unproductive, and lost in their search for identity, had little in common. So Nancy took a job as a secretary for the telephone company, and Michelle found work as a lineman for the electric company. Then they heard about the Swami in Haight-Ashbury and decided to visit the temple. It was an evening kirtan, and the irrepressible hippies were traveling, twisting and wiggling. Michelle and Nancy took a seat on the floor off to one side, impressed more by the presence of the Swami than by the kirtana. After the kirtana, Prabhupada lectured, but they found his accent heavy. They wanted to understand. They had an innate feeling that he was saying something valuable, and yet the secrets seemed locked behind a thick accent and within a book written in another language. They decided to come back in the morning and try again. At the morning program, they found a smaller group, a dozen devotees with beads for chanting draped around their necks. A few street people. The kirtan seemed sweeter and more mellow, and Michelle and Nancy chanted, they danced along with the devotees. Then Prabhupada spoke, and this time they caught a few of his ideas. They stayed for breakfast and become friends with Mukunda and Janki. Sam and Mirjori, now Sham Sundar and Malati. Yamuna and Gurudas and Govindadasi and Gaur Sundar. They liked the devotees and promised to come again that evening. Soon they were regularly attending the morning and evening programs, and Nancy, along with the other women, was attending Prabhupada's weekend cooking classes. Michel was open to Prabhupada's idea, but he had difficulty accepting the necessity of surrendering to a spiritual authority. His tendency was to reject authorities, but the more he thought about it, the more he saw that Prabhupada was right. He had to accept an authority. He reasoned, every time I stop at a red light, I am accepting an authority. And finally, he concluded that to progress in spiritual understanding, he would have to accept a spiritual authority. Yet, because he did not want to accept it, he was in a dilemma. Finally, after hearing Prabhupada's lecture for 2 weeks, Michel decided to surrender to Prabhupada's authority and try to become Krishna consciousness. Now, Michel, Nancy, and I decided to get married and become Swamiji's disciples and member of his society. We told some of the devotees we would like to see Swamiji. They said, yes, just go up. He is on the 3rd floor. We were a little surprised that there were no formalities required. And when we got to the door, his servant Ranchor let us in. We went in with our shoes on, so Ranchor had to ask us to take them off. I didn't know exactly what to say to Swamiji. I was depending on my future wife to make the initial opening. But then I finally said, we came because we would like to become members of your Krishna Conscious Society. He said, this was very nice. Then I said that actually the main reason we were there was that we wanted to be married. We knew that he performed marriage ceremonies and that it was part of society's requirement that couple had to be duly married before they could live together. Swamiji asked me if I liked the philosophy and if I had a job. My answer to both questions was yes. He explained that first of all, we would have to be initiated and then we could be married the next month. After their initiation, Michelle received the name Dayananda and Nancy received the name Nandarani. Soon Prabhupada performed their marriages. Nandarani, we knew it would be a very big wedding in Hyde, Ashbury. Whenever Swamiji would perform a wedding, hundreds of people would come and the temple would be filled. My parents were coming and Dayananda's parents were also coming. Swamiji said that it was proper that I cook. He said I should come to his apartment on the morning of the wedding and he would help me cook something for the wedding feast. So that morning I put my best jeans and my best sweatshirt and my boots and I went off to Swamiji's apartment. When I got upstairs, I walked in with my boots on. Swamiji was sitting there in his rocking chair. He smiled at me and said, "Oh, you have come to cook?" I said, "Yes." He sat there and looked at me. One of those long silent stares. He said, "First take off the boots." After I took my boots and my old leather jacket, Swamiji got up and went into the kitchen. He got a very large pot that had been burned so thick on the bottom that practically there was no metal visible. He handed it to me and said, "We want to boil milk in this pot. It has to be washed." There wasn't a sink in Swamiji's kitchen, only a tiny round basin. So I went into the bathroom, put the pot in the bathtub and rinsed it out. I assumed Swamiji did not want the black off the bottom because it was burned on. So I brought it back to him and said, "Oh, this is very clean, but just take off this little black on the bottom here." I said, "Okay," and got a knife and crawled into the bathtub and started scrubbing the black off. I worked and worked and worked and scrubbed and scrubbed. I had cleanser up to my elbows and I made a mess everywhere. I had gotten about half the black off The rest seemed to be more or less an integral part of the bottom. So I took the pot back to Swamiji and said, "This is the best I can do. All of this is burnt on." He said, "Yes, yes, you have done a wonderful job. Now just take off this black that's left." So I went back into the bathtub and scrubbed and scrubbed and scrubbed. It was almost midday when I came out of the bathtub with all the black scrubbed off the bottom of the pot. He was so happy when I brought the pot in. It was sparkling. A big smile came on his face and he said, "Oh, this is perfect." I was exhausted. Then Swamiji welcomed me into his kitchen and taught me how to make rasgullas. We boiled the milk, curdled it, and then I sat down and began rolling the curd into balls on a tray. As I rolled the balls, I would put them in a little row along the tray, and every single ball had to be exactly the same size. Swamiji would take his thumb and first and second fingers and shoot the balls out of the row when they weren't the right size. And I would have to remake them until they were the right size. This went on until I had a full tray of balls and the same size. The Swamiji showed me how to boil the balls of curd in sugar water. Malati, Janaki, and I were cooking in the kitchen, and Swamiji was singing. At one point, Swamiji stopped singing and asked me, "Do you know what your name means?" I couldn't even remember what my name was. He had told me at initiation, but because none of us used our devotee names, I couldn't remember what mine was. I said, "No, Swamiji, what does my name mean?" He said, "It means you are the mother of Krishna." And he laughed loudly and went back to stirring the rasgullas. I couldn't understand who Krishna was, who in the world his mother would be, or how I was in any way related to her. But I was satisfied that Swamiji felt that I was somebody worth being. I finished cooking that afternoon about 4 o'clock, and then I went home to get dressed for the wedding. Although I had never worn anything but old dresses and jeans, Swamiji had suggested to the other ladies that they find a way to put me into a sari for the wedding. So we brought a piece of silk to use for a sari. I went to Malati's house. She was going to try to help me put it on. I couldn't keep it on, so she had to sew it on me. Then they decorated me with flowers and took me to Swamiji and showed him. He was very happy. He said, "This is the way our women should always look. No more jeans and dresses. They should always wear saris." Actually, I looked afraid. I kept stumbling, and they had to sew the cloth on me. But thought Swamiji thought it was wonderful. The cloth was all one color. So Swamiji said, "Next time you should buy cloth that has a little border on the bottom. So it's two colors." I like two colors better. When we went downstairs to the wedding, Swamiji met my relatives. He spoke to them very politely. My mother carried a lot during the ceremonies. I was very satisfied that she had been blessed by meeting Swamiji. Steve Bartlett, age 20, born and raised in New York, and now living in hippie life in San Francisco, had read in the Oracle about Swami Bhakti Vedanta coming to San Francisco. The idea of meeting an Indian Swamiji had interested him, and responding to a notice he had seen posted on Hyde Street, he had gone along with Caroline Gold, the woman he was living with, to the airport to meet Swami Bhakti Vedanta. He and Caroline had both gotten a blissful lift by chanting Hare Krishna and seeing Prabhupada, and they began regularly attending the lectures and kirtanas at the temple. Steve decided he wanted to become like the Swami, so he and Carolyn went together to see Prabhupada and request initiation. Speaking privately with Prabhupada in his room, they discussed obedience to the spiritual master and becoming vegetarian. When Prabhupada told them that they should either stop living together or get married, they said they would like to get married. An initiation date was set. Prabhupada asked Steve to shave his long hair and beard. Why do you want me to shave my head? Steve protested. Krishna had long hair, Rama had long hair, Lord Chaitanya had long hair, the Christ had long hair. Why should I shave my head? Prabhupada smiled and replied, because now you are following me. There was a print on the wall of Suradas, a Vaishnava. You should shave your head like that. Prabhupada said, pointing to Surdas. I don't think I am ready to do that yet, Steve said. All right, you are still a young man. There is still time, but at least you should shave your face clean and cut your hair like a man. On the morning of initiation, Steve shaved off his beard and cut his hair around his ear so that it was short in front, but long in the back. How's this? He asked. You should cut the back also. Prabhupada replied. Steve agreed. To Steve, Prabhupada gave the name Subala and to Carolyn the name Krishna Devi. A few days later, he performed their wedding. Since each ceremony was another occasion for kirtan and prasadam distribution, onlookers become attracted. And as the spiritual names and married couples increased with each ceremony, Prabhupada's spiritual family grew. The harmonious atmosphere was like that of a small loving family, and Prabhupada dealt with his disciples intimately without the formalities of an institution or hierarchy. Disciples would approach him for various reasons, entering the little apartment to be alone with him as he sat on a mat before his makeshift desk in the morning sunlight. When men like Mukunda, Gurudas, and Sham Sundar, Swamiji was a friend. With Janaki and Govinda Dasi, he was sometimes ready to be chided, almost like their naughty son. Or he would be their grandfather's fatherly teacher of cooking, the enforcers of the rules of the kitchen cleanliness. And to all of them, he was unfathomable, pure devotee of Lord Krishna, who knew the conclusions of all Vedic scriptures and who knew beyond all doubts the truth of transmigration. He could answer all questions. He could lead them beyond material life, beyond height, Ashbury, hippydom, and into the spiritual world of Krishna. It was 7 p.m. Srila Prabhupada entered the temple dressed in a saffron dhoti, an old turtleneck jersey under a cardigan sweater, and a chadar around his shoulders. Walking to the dais in the rear of the room, he took his seat. The dais, a cushion atop a redwood plank 2 feet off the floor, was supported between two redwood columns. In front of the dais stood a cloth-covered lectern with a bucket of cut flowers on either side. Covering the wall behind the dais was a typical Indian madras with Haridas crude painting of Lord Chaitanya in Kirtana hanging against it. Srila Prabhupada picked up his kartals, wrapped up the cloth straps around his forefingers, and looked out at his young followers sitting cross-legged on the burgundy rug. The men were bearded, and almost everyone wore long hair, beads, exotic clothing, and trinkets. The bulbs hanging from the ceiling diffused their lights through Japanese paper lanterns, and Navajo God's eye symbols dangled from strings. Prabhupada began the ringing 1, 2, 3 rhythm, and Sham Sundara began pumping the harmonium. Although the harmonium was a simple instrument, a miniature piano keyboard to be played with the right hand and a bellows to be pumped up with the left hand. So no one in the Frederick Street storefront knew how to play it. So it became simply the drone. Another important kirtana instrument, the two-headed mridanga from India, was meant for intricate rhythmic accompaniments, but even Mukunda could play it only very simply, matching the 1, 2, 3 Prabhupada's kartalas. There were other instruments on hand, a kettle drum, the pride of the temple, Haigriva's old cornet and few conch shells, and a horn Haigriva had made by shell-licking a piece of kelp he had found on the beach. Some guests had brought their own flutes, pipes, and bangos, but for now they let their instruments remain still and clap to Prabhupada's rhythm as he sang the every evening prayers. Prabhupada's Sanskrit hymns praise the Vaishnava spiritual masters. For each great devotee in the disciplic succession, he sang a specific prayer. First, he chanted the poetic description of the transcendental qualities of Sri Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati, then Gaur Kishore Das Babaji, Bhakti Vinod Thakur, one after another. One prayer described Srila Bhaktisiddhanta as the deliverer of the fallen souls, and another praised Gaur Kishore Das Babaji as renunciation personified, always merged in the feeling of separation and intense love for Krishna. Srila Prabhupada saying for Lord Chaitanya, the golden complexioned Supreme Personality of Godhead, who distributed pure love of Krishna, and he sang of Lord Krishna, the ocean of mercy, the friend of the distressed, the source of creation. As Prabhupada became absorbed in the bhajana, his body trembled with ecstatic emotion. The group on the floor sat swaying, his eyes closed in meditation, his delicate practiced fingers expertly playing the crumbles. They heard the heartfelt minor modes and tone of his voice, unlike anything they had heard before. Then he began the familiar mantra they had come to hear, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare. And immediately they joined him. The horns and drums sounded, and soon all the other instrument players joined in. Gradually, a few at a time, members of the audience rose to their feet and began to dance. Prabhupada's followers stood and began stepping from one side to side as he had shown them, sometimes raising their hands in the air, others moved as they pleased, occasionally opening his eyes and glancing around. Prabhupada sat firmly, chanting through his head and body were trembling. After 20 minutes, many of the young dancers were leaping, jumping, and perspiring as Prabhupada continued to sing. Leading the dancers by the beat of his kartalas, his eyes were closed, yet he controlled the entire wild congregation, playing his kartalas loudly. The chanting and dancing continued, and Prabhupada approved. The kirtan of these hippies was different from the chanting of Indian Brahmanas, but Prabhupada didn't mind. His standard was devotion. In his Radha Krishna temple, whatever he accepted, Krishna accepted. This was his offering to Krishna through his spiritual master. Bhakti Siddhanta Saraswati, Prabhupada was absolutely confident. Even if his young devotee didn't know how to play the harmonium, keyboard, or the mridanga, even if they didn't know that congregational kirtan should be done not in constant unison as they were doing, but responsively. And even if they didn't know how to honor the Guru, still, because they were chanting and dancing, he encouraged them and nodded to them, yes. Wild elements were there, of course, people whose minds and intentions were far away in some chemically induced fantasy, yet the mood was dominated by Srila Prabhupada's followers, who and danced with arms upraised and watched their leaders carefully. Although in many ways they were still like hippies, they were Swamiji's disciples. And they wanted to please him and follow his instructions. They wanted to attain Krishna consciousness. For all the varied punctuations of horns and timpani, the kirtana remained sweet. Haigriva even played his cornet in tune, and only during every other mantra. Srila Prabhupada knew that some aspects of the kirtana were wrong or below standard, but he accepted the offerings, and not awkwardly, but lovingly. He simply wanted these American boys and girls to chant, that they dressed irregularly, jumped too savagely, or had the wrong philosophy did not overconcern him. These boys and girls were chanting Hare Krishna, so at least for the present, they were pure. The hippies knew that too, and they loved it. Just as in Janki's dream, Srila Prabhupada's pleasure was to see the whole world engage in Kirtan. Somehow or other, he would say, people should be engaged in Kirtan, people should be engaged in Krishna consciousness. And this was the instruction of Lord Chaitanya's chief follower, Rupa Goswami, who had written, Tasmat Kenapya Upayena Manah Krishna Nivesayat. Somehow or other, fix the mind on Krishna. The rules and regulations can become later. Inherent in this attitude of Srila Prabhupada's and Srila Rupa Goswami's was a strong conviction about the purifying force of the holy name. If engaged in chanting Hare Krishna, even the most fallen person could gradually become a saintly devotee. Srila Prabhupada would often quote a verse from Srimad Bhagavatam, affirming that persons addicted to sinful acts would be purified by taking shelter of the devotees of the Lord. He knew that every height, Ashbury, hippie was eligible to receive the mercy of the holy name, and he saw it as his duty to his spiritual master to distribute the gift of Krishna consciousness freely, rejecting no one. Yet while living amongst this mlecha, he required a certain standard of behavior, and he was adamant about preserving the purity of his Krishna consciousness society. For example, if he were going to distribute free food to the public, it could not be ordinary food, but must be prasadam, food offered to Lord Shri Krishna. Feeding hungry people was fertile unless they were given prasadam, and the chance of liberation from birth and death. And although in the kirtans, he allowed openness and free expression and welcomed the wildest participation, the transcendental sound of the holy name had to dominate. He never allowed the kirtana to degenerate into mere beating of drums or chanting of any old words. Nor could anyone in the group become so crazy that others wouldn't be able to hear or take part in the congregational chanting. In his attempts to somehow or other get these young people chanting Hare Krishna, Prabhupada instinctively knew what to allow and what not to allow. He was the master, and his new disciples followed him when he permitted an egoistic, sensual dancer to jump around the temple or a drugged madman to argue with him in a question and answer period. When a person was too disruptive, Prabhupada was not afraid to stop him, but stopping was rare. The main thing was giving. The kirtana lasted more than an hour as the chanters joined hands and danced around the room, and incense poured out the front door. The morning and evening kirtanas had already made the Radha Krishna temple popular in Hyde Ashbury. But when the devotees began serving a daily free lunch, the temple became an integral part of community. Prabhupada told his disciples simply to cook and distribute prasadam. That would be their only activity during the day. In the morning, they would cook, and at noon, they would feed anyone who came, sometimes 150 to 2 hippies from the streets of Hyde Ashbury. Before the morning kirtana, the girls would put oatmeal on the stove, and by breakfast, there would be a room full of hippies, most of whom they had been up all night. The cereal and fruit was for you ready? Okay.
But the main program was the lunch. Malati would go out and shop, getting donations whenever possible for whole wheat flour, garbanzo flour, split peas, rice, and whatever vegetables get cheap for free or for free. Potatoes, carrots, turnips, rutabagas, beets. Then every day the cooks would prepare spiced mashed potatoes, buttered chapatis, split dal, and vegetable dish for 200 people. The lunch program was possible because many merchants were willing to donate to the recognized cause of feeding hippies. Harsharani. The lunch program attracted a lot of the hippie hill crowd who obviously wanted food. They were really hungry, and there were other people who would come also, people who were working with the temple but were not initiated. The record player would be playing the Swamiji's record. It was a nice family atmosphere. Haridasa. It was taken outside too, outside the front, but the main food was served inside. It was amazing. The people would just all huddle together, and we would really line them wall to wall. A lot of them would simply eat and leave. Other stores along Hyde Asbury were selling everything from beads to rock records, but our store was different because we were not selling anything. We were giving it away. And we were welcoming everybody. We were providing a kind of refuge from the tumult and madness of the scene. So it was in that sense a hospital. And I think a lot of people were helped and maybe even saved. I don't mean only their souls, I mean their minds and bodies were saved because of what was going on in the streets. And they just simply could not handle. I'm talking about overdoses of drugs, people who were plain lost and needed comforting and who sort of wandered or staggered into the temple. Some of them stayed and became devotees, and some of them took prasadam and left. Daily we had unusual incidents, and Swamiji witnessed it and took part in it. The lunch program was his idea, Mukunda. The Salvation Army came in one day for lunch. They just loaded a whole truckload of people on us, about 30 or 40. Leadership pen. Some of the community of those loose cynically took advantage of the free food. They did not appreciate the Swami because they said he was in his own way an Orthodox minister, and they were much more interested in being unorthodox. It was a fairly cynical thing. Those who were more interested and had questions, the spiritual seekers, would visit Swamiji in his room. Many of them would come in complete anxiety over the war in Vietnam or whatever was going on, trouble with the law, bad experiences on drugs, a falling out with school or family. There was much public concern about the huge influx of youth into San Francisco, a situation that was creating an almost uncomfortable social problem. Police and social welfare workers were worried about health problems and poor living conditions, especially in Haight-Ashbury. Some middle-class people feared a complete hippie takeover. The local authorities welcomed this service offered by Swami Bhaktivedanta's temple, and when civic leaders in Haight-Ashbury talked of forming a council to deal with the crisis, they requested Swami Bhaktivedanta to take part. He agreed, but lost interest after the first meetings. No one seemed seriously interested in hearing his solution. Master Subramania. A lot of responsible citizens in San Francisco were very happy that Swami Bhaktivedanta was working amongst the young people. The young people at that time were searching and needed somebody of a very high caliber who could take an interest in them and who would say, you should do this and you should not do that. The consensus was that no one could tell the young people what to do because they were completely out of hand with drugs and so forth. But Swamiji told them what to do, and they did it, and everyone was appreciated, especially the young people. Harsharani. Just from a medical standpoint, doctors did not know what to do with people on LSD. The police and the free clinics in the area couldn't handle the overload of people taking LSD. The police saw Swamiji as a certain refuge. Michael Bowen. Bhaktivedanta had an amazing ability through devotion to get people off drugs, especially speed, heroin, burnt out LSD cases, all of that. Haridasa. The police used to come with their paddy wagons through the park in the early hours of the morning and pick up runaway teenagers sleeping in the park. The police would round them up and try to send them back home. The hippies needed all the help they could get, and they knew it. And the Radha Krishna temple was certainly a kind of spiritual haven. Kids sensed it. They were running, living on the streets, no place where they could go, where they could rest, where people were not going to hurt them. A lot of kids would literally fall into temple. I think it saved a lot of lives. There might have been a lot more casualties if it hadn't been for Hare Krishna. It was like opening a temple in the battlefield. It was the darkest place to do it, but it was the place where it was most needed. Although the Swami had no precedence for dealing with any of this, he applied the chanting with miraculous results. This chanting was wonderful. It worked. Srila Prabhupada knew that only Krishna consciousness could help. Others had their remedies, but Prabhupada considered them mere patchwork. He knew that ignorantly identifying the self with the body was the real cause of suffering. How could someone help himself but to speak of others if he did not know who he was, if he did not know that the body was only a covering of the real self, the spirit soul, which could be happy only in its original nature as an eternal servant of Krishna? Understanding that Lord Krishna considered there's anyone who approached him in a virtuous person, and that even a little devotional service would never be lost and could save a person at the time of death. Srila Prabhupada had opened his door to everyone, even the most abject runaway. But for a lost soul to fully receive the balm of Krishna consciousness, he would first have to stay a while and chant, inquire, listen, and follow. As Allen Ginsberg headed by his 5,000 hippies at the Avalon, the early morning kirtana at the temple provided a vital community service for those who were coming down from LSD and wanted to stabilize their consciousness on re-entry. Allen himself sometimes dropped by in the morning with the acquaintances with whom he had stayed up all night. Allen Ginsberg. At 6:30 in the morning, we went over to Swami Bhaktivedanta's space station for some chanting and a little Krishna consciousness. There were about 30 or 40 people there, all chanting Hare Krishna to this new tune they made up just for mornings. One kid got a little freaked out by the scene at first, but then he relaxed, and afterwards he told me, at first I thought, what is this? But then suddenly I realized I was just not grooving with where I was. I wasn't being where I was. On occasion, the re-entries would come flying in out of control for crash landings in the middle of the night. One morning at 2 a.m., the boys sleeping in the storefront were awakened by a pounding at the door, screaming, and police lights. When they opened the door, a young hippie with a wild red hair and beard plunged in, crying, "Oh, Krishna, Krishna, oh, help me. Oh, don't let them get me. Oh, for God's sake, help." A policeman stuck his head in the door and smiled. "We decided to bring him by here," he said, "because we thought maybe you guys could help him." "I'm not comfortable in this body," the boy screamed as the policeman shut the door. The boy began chanting furiously and turned white, sweating profusely in terror. Swamiji's boys spent the rest of the early morning consoling him and chanting with him until the Swami came down for kirtana and class. The devotees often sent distressing people to Swamiji with their problems, and they allowed almost anyone to see Swamiji and take up his valuable time. While walking around San Francisco, Ravindra Swarupa once met a man who claimed to have seen people from Mars in his tent when he had been stationed in Vietnam. The man, who had just been discharged from an army hospital, said that Martians had talked to him. Ravindra Swarupa told him about Swamiji's book, Easy Journey to Other Planets, which verifies the idea of life in other planets. And he suggested that the Swami could probably tell him more about the people from Mars. So the man visited the Swami up in his apartment. "Yes, Swamiji answered, there are Martians." Gradually, Prabhupada's followers became more considerate of their spiritual master and began protecting him from persons they thought might be undesirable. One such undesirable was Rabbit, perhaps the dirtiest hippie in Hyde Asbury. Rabbit's hair was always disheveled, dirty, and even filled with lice. His clothes were ragged and filthy, and his dirt-caked body stank. He wanted to meet Prabhupada, but the devotees refused, not wanting to defile Prabhupada's room with Rabbit's nasty, stinking presence. One night after the lecture, however, Rabbit waited outside the temple door. As Prabhupada approached, Rabbit asked, "May I come up and see you?" Prabhupada agreed. As for challengers, almost every night someone would come to argue with Prabhupada. One man came regularly with prepared arguments from a philosophy book, from which he would read aloud. Prabhupada would defeat him, and the man would go home, prepare another argument, and come back again with his book. One night, after the man had presented his challenge, Prabhupada simply looked at him without bothering to reply. Prabhupada's neglect was another defeat for the man, who got up and left. Israel, like Rabbit, was another well-known High-Tasbury character. He had a long ponytail and often played the trumpet during kirtana. After one of Prabhupada's evening lectures, Israel challenged, "This chanting may be nice, but what will it do for the world? What will it do for humanity?" Prabhupada replied, "Are you not in the world? If you like it, why will others not like it? So you chant loudly." A mustached man standing at the back of the room asked, "Are you Allen Ginsberg's guru?" Many of the devotees knew that the question was loaded with that to answer. Either yes or no would be difficult. Srila Prabhupada replied, "I'm nobody's guru. I'm everybody's servant." To the devotees, the whole exchange became transcendental due to Swamiji's reply. Swami had not simply giving a clever response. He had answered out of a deep, natural humility. One morning, a couple attended the lecture, a woman carrying a child and a man wearing a backpack. During the question and answer period, the man asked, "What about my mind?" Prabhupada gave him philosophical replies, but the man kept repeating, "What about my mind? What about my mind?" With a pleading, compassionate look, Prabhupada said, "I have no other medicine. Please chant this Hare Krishna. I have no other explanation. I have no other answer." But the man kept talking about his mind. Finally, one of the women devotees interrupted and said, "Just do what he says, just try it." And Prabhupada picked up his karatalas and began kirtana. One evening, a boy burst into a lecture exclaiming that a riot was gathering on Haida Street. The Swami should come immediately, address the crowd, and calm everyone down. Mukunda explained that it wasn't necessary for Swami to go. Others could help. The boy just stared at Prabhupada as if giving an ultimatum. Unless Swamiji came immediately, there would be a riot, and Swamiji would be to blame. Prabhupada spoke as if preparing to do what the boy wanted. "Yes, I am prepared," but nobody went, and there was no riot. Usually during the kirtana, at least one dancer would carry on in a narcissistic, egoistic way, occasionally becoming lewd to the point where Prabhupada would ask the person to stop. One evening before Śrila Prabhupada had come down from his apartment, a girl in a miniskirt began whistling and gyrating in the temple during kirtana. When one of the devotees went upstairs and told Prabhupada, he replied, "That's all right. Let her use her energy for Krishna. I'm coming soon and I will see for myself." When Prabhupada arrived and started another kirtana, the girl who was very skinny again began to wriggle and gyrate. Prabhupada opened his eyes and saw her. He frowned and glanced at some of his disciples, indicating his displeasure. Taking the girl aside, one of the women escorted her out. A few minutes later, the girl returned, wearing slacks and dancing in a more reserved style. Prabhupada was sitting on his dais, lecturing to a full house, when the fat girl who had been sitting on the window seat suddenly stood up and began hollering at him. "Are you just going to sit there?" she yelled. "What are you going to do now? Come on, aren't you going to say something? What are you going to do? Who are you?" Her action was so sudden and her speech so violent that no one in the temple responded. Unangered, Prabhupada sat very quietly. He appeared hurt. Only the devotee sitting closest to him heard him say softly as if to himself, "It is the darkest of darkness." Another night, while Prabhupada was lecturing, a boy came up and sat on the dais beside him. The boy faced out toward the audience and interrupted Prabhupada. "I would like to say something now." Prabhupada politely said, "Wait until after the class. Then we have questions." The boy waited for a few minutes, still sitting on the dais, and Prabhupada continued to lecture. But again the boy interrupted. "I got something to say. I want to say what I have to say now." The devotees in the audience looked up astonished, thinking that Swamiji would handle the matter and not wanting to cause a disturbance. None of them did anything. They simply sat while the boy began talking incoherently. Then Prabhupada picked up his kartalas. "All right, let us have kirtana." The boy sat in the same place throughout the kirtana, looking crazily, sometimes menacingly at Prabhupada. After half an hour, the kirtana stopped. Prabhupada cut an apple into small pieces as was his custom. He then placed the paring knife at the piece of apple in his right hand and held his hand out to the boy. The boy looked at Prabhupada, then down at the apple and knife. The room became silent. Prabhupada sat motionless, smiling slightly at the boy. After a long, tense moment, the boy reached out. A sigh rose from the audience as the boy chose a piece of an apple from Prabhupada's open hand. Haridasa, I used to watch how Swamiji would handle things. It wasn't easy. To me, that was a real test of his powers and understanding. How to handle these people, not to alienate or antagonize or stir them up to create more trouble. He would turn their energy so that before they knew it, they were calm, like when you pat a baby and it stops crying. Swamiji had a way of doing that with words, with the intonation of his voice, with his patience to let them carry on for a certain period of time, let them work it out, act it out even. I guess he realized that the devotees just couldn't say, listen, when you come to the temple, you can't behave this way. It was a delicate situation there. Often someone would say, I'm God. They would get an insight of hallucination from their drugs. They would try to steal the spotlight. They wanted to be heard, and you could feel an anger against the Swami from the people like that. Sometimes they would speak inspired and poetic for a while, but they couldn't sustain it, and their speech would become gibberish. And the Swami was not one to simply pacify people. He wasn't going to coddle them. He would say, what do you mean? If you are God, then you have to be all-knowing. You have to have the attributes of God. Are you omniscient and omnipotent? He would then name all the characteristics that one would have to be an avatara, to be God. He would rationally prove the person wrong. He had superior knowledge, and he would rationally explain to them, if you are God, can you do this? Do you have this power? Sometimes people would take it as a challenge and would try to have a verbal battle with Swami. The audience's attention would then swing to the disturbing individual, the person who was grabbing the spotlight. Sometimes it was very difficult. I used to sit there and wonder, how is he going to handle this guy? This one is really a problem. But Swamiji was hard to defeat. Even if he couldn't convince a person, he convinced the other people in the crowd so that the energy of the room would change and it would tend to quiet the person. Swamiji would win the audience by showing them that this person did not know what he was talking about. And the person would feel the vibration of the room change, and the audience was no longer listening or believing his spiel. And so the person would shut up. So Swamiji would remove the audience rather than the person. He would do it without crushing the person. He would do it by superior intelligence, but also with a lot of compassion. When I saw him do these things, then I realized he was a great teacher and a great human being. He had the sensitivity not to injure a person physically or emotionally. So that when the person sat down and shut up, he wouldn't be doing it in defeat or anger. He would not be hurt. He would just be outwitted by Swami. Even while translating in the privacy of his room, Srila Prabhupada was interrupted by disturbances. Once police cars and ambulances, sirens screaming, lights flashing, converged beneath his window after the Hell Angels had started a fight in the digger's store in the next building. On another occasion, about 1:30 a.m., while Prabhupada was dictating the teachings of Lord Chaitanya, a girl repeatedly knocked and called at Prabhupada's door. At first, he ignored the interruption. Since her arrival to San Francisco, he had completed many pages of this important book. Lord Chaitanya's discussion with Rupa Goswami and Sanatana Goswami, Ramananda, Raya, and others explored many Krishna conscious topics mentioned only briefly in Bhagavad Gita. In the West, almost no one knew about these teachings of Lord Chaitanya, and now Srila Prabhupada intended to compile these teachings in one volume, providing the most complete presentation of Bhakti Yoga ever introduced in English. Such a book would give great substance to the Krishna consciousness movement, but now his solitary concentration was being interrupted by a knocking at his door and a woman's voice calling. Getting up from his desk, Prabhupada went to the front room but did not open the door. Who is there? A young woman answered. I want to speak to you. Come back later in the morning, Prabhupada told her. He knew that in San Francisco, just as in New York, he would not always be able to write peacefully. Preaching in America meant having to tolerate just this, a crazy call in the middle of the night, tearing one away from ecstatic concentration on the pastimes of Lord Chaitanya. The lost souls of Hyde Asbury, with their illusions of knowledge, their cries for help, their arrogant challenges, pulled his attention away from his mission of translating and commenting on the scriptures. Now, alone in his apartment, speaking through the locked door, Prabhupada told his intruder that he had work to do and that she should go away. He promised he would see her later that day. He was ready to speak with the hippies all day, but the early morning hours were a special time for his literary work. Preaching face to face to the conditioned soul was important. He had come here to preach, but he had picked these early hours to speak intimately to the whole world through his books without disturbance. The girl, however, continued pounding and calling until Prabhupada finally opened the door. There, standing in the hallway, he saw a teenage hippie with a glassy stare and deranged appearance. He asked her what she wanted. She remained tensely silent. Speak, he told her. She stepped into his room. He saw her helpless, a victim in the ocean of Maya, and he asked her repeatedly what she wanted. Finally, the girl stared at him with widened eyes and exclaimed, "Look, Mahaula." Prabhupada decided to awaken Mukunda, who lived down the hall. He stepped barefoot into the hallway. The girl followed, shutting the self-locking door behind her. Now he was locked out of his apartment. She continued to stare at him defiantly in the bare and friendly surroundings of a corridor and of locked doors at 1 in the morning. This was why the Babajis of Vrindavan stayed in their little cottages, chanting the holy name to avoid being bothered by ungodly people. The Babajis, of course, never even dreamed of these bizarre intrusions from the psychedelic San Francisco night. At Mukunda's door, Prabhupada began pounding and calling loudly. Mukunda, Mukunda, Mukunda awoke and opened the door, astonished to see his spiritual master standing barefoot in the hallway, a wild-eyed young girl standing a few feet behind, yet Prabhupada remained grave and aloof. This girl came to my door, he began. He explained briefly what had happened and what should now be done. He did not appear angry or harassed by the girl, and he indicated that Mukunda should deal kindly with her. Mukunda remembered when Prabhupada had been driven out of his New York Bowery loft by his roommate David Allen, who had gone mad on LSD. Then also Prabhupada had remained cool-headed though caught by a dangerous and awkward circumstance. Mukunda went downstairs and awoke Hayagriva, who had the key to Prabhupada's apartment. Srila Prabhupada then returned to his room and to his dictation of teachings of Lord Chaitanya. Mukunda saw the girl down to the street and admonished her not to bother an elderly gentleman like the Swami at such an hour. Staring at Mukunda, she said, "You are not ready," and walked away. At 7 o'clock, when Prabhupada came down to the temple for the morning class, the girl was sitting in the audience in the calmest state of mind. She apologized. Later in the day, Prabhupada repeated the story in a good humor, recounting how he had several times asked the girl to speak. He opened his eyes wide, imitating her expression, and said, "Look, Mahaula," and laughed. "We shall go for a walk at 6:30, Srila Prabhupada said one morning. "You can drive me to the park." Several devotees accompanied him to Golden Gate Park, Stove Lake. They knew the park well and that Srila Prabhupada on the scenic walk around the lake, over a bridge, through forest and close paths, and across a small rivulet, hoping to please him with nature's beauty. As he walked, striding quickly, he would point to a tree or stop to examine a flower. "What is this tree?" he would ask. "What is this flower?" Although his disciples were usually at loss to answer. When Chaitanya Mahaprabhu passed through the forest of Vrindavana, he said, all the plants, trees, and creepers were delighted to see him and rejoiced in his presence. The plant life there is like that in the spiritual sky, fully conscious. And these trees, Swamiji, how conscious are they? Oh, the spirit soul is there, Prabhupada said, but the consciousness has been arrested temporarily. Perception is more limited. Whatever Prabhupada saw, he saw through the eyes of scripture, and his comments on the most ordinary things were full of transcendental instruction. As he walked, he reflected aloud. Those who want to see God must first have the qualifications to see God. They must be purified. Just like the cloud is now covering the sun. They say, oh, the sun is not out, but the sun is there. Only our eyes are covered. Like our tour guides, the boys led Prabhupada to the more picturesque areas. They came upon swans gliding on the lake. Srimad Bhagavatam, Prabhupada said, compares devotees to swans and the literature about Lord Krishna to beautiful, clear lakes. The non-devotees, he said, were the crows attracted by the rubbish of mundane topics. Walking over a gravel path, he stopped and drew their attention. Look at the pebbles. As many pebbles are there are that many universes. And in each universe, there are innumerable living entities. The devotees delighted in bringing Swamiji to a rhododendron glen. Its big bushes completely covered with white and pink flowers, and they felt privileged to see Krishna through Swamiji's eyes. The next morning, when Prabhupada again wanted to go to the park, more devotees accompanied him. They had heard from the others how Swamiji had displayed a different mood while walking. Again, the boys were ready to lead him along new trails around the lake, but without announcing a change in plans, he walked up and down the Macadam Road beside the lake. Prabhupada and his followers came upon a flock of sleeping ducks. Awakened by the sound of people walking on the path, ducks began quacking, moving their wings and walking away. When a few devotees hurried ahead to shoo the ducks from the Prabhupada's path, the ducks began making sounds of grouching and grumbling. Move, you ducks, one devotee said. You're disturbing Swamiji. Prabhupada said quietly. As we are thinking they are disturbing us, they are thinking we are disturbing them. Prabhupada stopped beneath a large tree and pointed to some bird droppings on the ground. What does this mean? He asked, turning to a new boy who stood beside him. Prabhupada's face was serious. The boy blushed. I don't know what it means. Prabhupada remained thoughtful, waiting for an explanation. The devotees gathered around him, looking intently down at the bird droppings. The boy thought the Swami might be expecting him to decipher some hidden meaning in the pattern of the droppings, the way people read the future in tea leaves. He felt he should say something. Is excreta, defecations of birds? Prabhupada smiled and turned toward the others for an answer. They were silent. It means, said Prabhupada, that these birds, he pronounced the word birds, have lived in the same tree for more than 2 weeks. He laughed. Even the birds are attached to their apartments. As they passed the shuffleboard courts and the old man playing checkers, Prabhupada stopped and turned to the boys. Just see, he said, all people in this country do not know what to do. So they play like children, wasting their last days, which should be meant for developing Krishna consciousness. Their children are grown and gone away, so this is a natural time for spiritual cultivation. But no, they get some cat or dog, and instead of serving God, they serve dog. It is most unfortunate, but they will not listen. Their ways are set. Therefore, we are speaking to the youth who are searching. When Prabhupada and the boys passed the sloping green lawn just off Kezar Drive, the boys pointed out that this was the famous hippie hill. In the early mornings, the gently sloping hill and the big quiet meadow surrounded by the eucalyptuses and oaks were silent and still. But in a few hours, hundreds of hippies would gather here to lounge on the grass, meet friends, and get high. Prabhupada advised the boys to come here and hold kirtanas. Chapter 23, The Price Affair. Swamiji's disciples in New York were surprised to find that they could still carry on in his absence. At first, rising early, going to the storefront, and holding the morning kirtana and class had been difficult. Without Swamiji, everything had seemed empty. But he had taught them what to do, and gradually they realized that they should simply follow what he had shown them, or even imitate as a child imitates his parents. And it worked. At first, they had been too shy to speak or read the kirtana, so they had played tapes of Swamiji's kirtanas and classes. But when the evenings came and guests attended the temple, the devotees felt compelled to give live classes. Rama, Brahmananda, Satsvarupa, and Rupa Nuga took turns giving brief talks and even answering challenging questions from the same Lower East Side audiences that Śrila Prabhupada had lying tamed for 6 months. Things were shaky and lacking without him, and yet in a sense he was still present. And the devotees found that everything, the chanting, the cooking, the taking of prasadam, the preaching, could still go on. On January 19, just 3 days after his arrival in San Francisco, Prabhupada had written back to his New York disciples. They were his spiritual children and were very dear to him. Although far from his homeland, India, he had not thought first of writing anyone there. Since he was a sannyasi, he had no interest in writing to any family members or relatives. And as for writing to his god brothers, there was not much importance in that, since they had repeatedly shown their reluctance to help. But being in a new city among new faces and having met with an initial fanfare success, Prabhupada had wanted to share the news with those most eager to hear from him. He had also wanted to reassure his disciples, for whom, after only a few months of training, he was expecting to conduct the Krishna consciousness movement in New York. My dear Brahmananda, Hayagriva, Kirtananda, Satsvarupa, Gargamuni, Ashitananda, Jadurani, please accept my greetings and blessings of Guru Gauranga, Giridhari, Gandharvika. You have already got the news of our safe arrival and good reception by devotees here. Mr. Allen Ginsberg and about 50 or 60 others received us on the airport, and when I arrived in my apartment, there were some press reporters also who took note of my mission. 2-3 papers like Examiner and the Chronicles, etc., have already published the report. One of the reports is sent here with, please find. I wish that 1,000 copies of this report may be offset, printed at once, and 100 copies of the same may be sent here as soon as possible. I understand that you were feeling my absence. Krishna will give you strength. Physical presence is immaterial. Presence of the transcendental sound received from the spiritual master should be the guidance of your life. That will make our spiritual life successful. If you feel very strongly about my absence, you may place my pictures on my sitting places, and this will be source of inspiration for you. I'm very much anxious to hear about the final decisions of the House. I wish to open the House by the 1st of March 1967, and the arrangement may be done dexterously in this connection. I have not yet, as yet, received for the tapes of dictaphone, and I have sent you tapes yesterday. Please offer my blessings to Shriman Neil. Shriman Rayarama is cooking well and distributing prasadam to the devotees, numbering sometimes 70. It is very encouraging. I think this Sanjay will be a very nice branch without delay. Everything is perspective. Hope you are well and awaiting your early reply. The letter had helped, especially the second paragraph. Brahmananda had posted it in the storefront. Now Swamiji had clearly enunciated that they were still with him, and he was in New York with them. It was something special, service to the spiritual master in separation, and even the devotees in San Francisco who were with Swamiji every day could not yet know its special taste. While the devotees in New York performed their daily duties, they often quoted from the letter and thought about it. Krishna will give you strength. Physical presence is immaterial. Presence of the transcendental sound received from the spiritual master should be the guidance of life. That will make our spiritual life successful. Although Prabhupada had written that they could place his photograph on his seat, no one had a photograph. They had to ask the devotees in San Francisco for one. A boy took some poor color snapshots and sent them to New York, and devotees placed one at Prabhupada's sitting place in his apartment. It helped. For Prabhupada also, the letter to his disciple in New York marked as a milestone. This was the basis on which he hoped to conduct a world movement. He could travel from place to place and yet be simultaneously present in many places by his instructions. Brahmananda, as president of the New York Temple, frequently performed in San Francisco. The chanting is the focal point, he told Hayagriva. We can always sit and chant. We are beginning to understand what Swamiji meant when he said that worship in separation is more relishable. And Srila Prabhupada wrote to his New York disciples regularly, at least once a week. Brahmananda got most of the business instructions, arranged to purchase a new building in New York, see Mr. Kalman to get copies of Kirtana record, get a copy of the movie a filmmaker had made of the devotees. Investigate the possibility of publishing Bhagavad Gita. If I am assisted by one expert typewriter, Prabhupada wrote Brahmananda, we can publish every 3 months a book. And the more we have books, the more we become respectable. Swarupa got a letter from Prabhupada asking him to type the dictated tapes of the new book, Teachings of Lord Chaitanya. Although Prabhupada's type at Snil had gone to San Francisco, after a day he had disappeared. I think you have 5 tapes with you because I have got only 3 with me, Prabhupada wrote. See that the tapes do not miss. Swarupa had written inquiring how he would be able to understand transcendental knowledge. You are a sincere devotee of the Lord's, Prabhupada replied, and certainly he will bless you with auspicious advancement in the matter of spiritual understanding. Raya Rama got a letter encouraging him to continue publishing the magazine. Back to Godhead will always remain the backbone of the society. Your ambition should always be how to improve the quality. Asyutananda, one of the youngest devotees, only 18, was now working alone in the kitchen. In a letter Srila Prabhupada wrote to 5 devotees, signing his name 5 times, he told Achyutananda, since Kirtananda is absent, certainly you are feeling some strain, but the more you serve Krishna, the more you become stronger. I hope you are being properly assisted by your other god brothers. Prabhupada advised Garga Muni, also 18, to cooperate with his older god brothers. Asking whether Garga Muni had gone to seek his mother, Prabhupada said he hoped she was all right. Since Garga Muni was the temple treasurer, Srila Prabhupada advised him checks should be drawn with full deliberation. Prabhupada wrote Jadurani, I always remember you as the nicest girl because you were so devotedly engaged in the service of Krishna. She had informed him that she had been cheated by a boyfriend, and Srila Prabhupada replied, better you accept Krishna as your husband, and he will never be unfaithful. Devote yourself, therefore, 24 hours in the service of Krishna and see how you feel happy in all respects. Rupanuga had written Prabhupada that the temperature in New York had dropped below 0 and that there had been 22-day blizzard. Srila Prabhupada wrote, certainly the situation would have been a little troublesome for me because I'm an old man. I think Krishna wanted to protect me by shifting me here at San Francisco. Here the climate is certainly like India and I'm feeling comfortable, but uncomfortable also because at New York I felt at home on account of so many beloved students like you. As you are feeling my absence, so I am feeling for you. But we are all happy on account of Krishna consciousness, either here or there. May Krishna join us always in his transcendental service. The neophyte disciples in New York felt assurance from their spiritual master's words, and by their own experience, service and separation was a transcendental fact. They were improving and enchanting on their beats, and the New York Center was going on. So long our kirtanas are all right, Prabhupada wrote, there is no difficulty at all. But there was one difficulty, attempts to purchase a new building, which had gone on smoothly while Prabhupada had been present, had become a great problem as soon as he had left. Shortly after Srila Prabhupada's departure for San Francisco, Brahmananda had given Mr. Price $1,000, and Mr. Price had promised to help the devotees get their building. When Prabhupada heard this, he became perturbed. In the opinion of the devotees and the trustees here, 1,000 had been risked without any understanding. I know that you are doing your best, but still there has been an error of judgment. I am not at all displeased with you, but they say that Mr. Price will never be able to secure financial help from any other source. He's simply taking time under different pretexts, changing constantly. Therefore, you should not pay even at parting more than what you have paid. If he wants any more money, you should flatly refuse. Srila Prabhupada remembered Mr. Price and their first meeting at which the blonde-haired, elegantly dressed businessman, his face tanned even in winter, had addressed him as Your Excellency. That address alone had made Prabhupada distrust him. There was a Bengali saying, "Too much devotion denotes a thief." Prabhupada knew that businessmen were prone to cheat and that an American businessman would be particularly difficult to deal with. Prabhupada's American disciples were innocent children in worldly affairs. He was ready to instruct them by step, but now, without consulting him, they had become involved in an unbusinesslike transaction, risking $1,000 of the society's money without any written agreement. Srila Prabhupada had visited the building on Stuyvesant Street, and he wanted it. It was a historical, well-kept aristocratic building suitable for his New York headquarters. It was worth the 100,000 price if they could afford it, but it was difficult for Prabhupada to know from San Francisco what was going on between Brahmananda and the businessman. And the difficulty increased as letters and phone calls from Brahmananda introduced other persons involved. Aside from Mr. Price, there was Mr. Tyler, the owner, and Mr. Tyler's lawyer, who has seen independent of Mr. Tyler, and finally there was ISKCON's lawyer, who also had a mind of his own. Although Srila Prabhupada disciples usually surrendered to his directions, they seemed bent on listening to the businessman's promises, even though their spiritual master had cautioned them not to. Prabhupada became disturbed. His preaching in San Francisco was being threatened by fears that the businessman would cheat his society of what he had begun in New York. With no responsible advisors to turn to, Srila Prabhupada sometimes discussed the problem with Mukunda and other devotees in his room. They all agreed that the transaction seemed highly irregular. Brahmananda was probably being led on by false promises. Brahmananda, however, saw Mr. Price as a real person, a successful man who wanted to help the devotees. Although no other respectable businessman had ever shown interest, Mr. Price listened and sympathized, and he would greet the devotees with Hare Krishna. Brahmananda was well aware of the humble economic and social position of the devotees. They were almost all ex-hippies, and they were poor. But there was Mr. Price, a wealthy man with a diamond cufflinks, who was always glad to see him, shake his hand, pat his back, and speak appreciatively of the religion of India and the moral behavior of the small band of devotees. Mr. Price had received a group of devotees as guests in his apartment and said nice things about each one of them. He said that Hayagriva was an excellent writer, and that Back to Godhead was the best magazine in the market, and that its mimeographed appearance made it look even better than the slicks. He said that he would give the devotees a movie projector, and he came close to saying that if he could liquidate some of his money, he would give them the building. Brahmananda, who saw Mr. Price a few times a week, would come away intoxicated with high hopes. The Krishna consciousness movement could rise to success through this wealthy man's patronage. After leaving Mr. Price's office, Brahmananda would rejoin the devotees in the evening and tell them all that had happened. On nights when there were no public kirtanas, the devotees would hold meetings. Swamiji had named them Ishta Goshtis to discuss the instructions of the spiritual master. And the Ishta Goshtas became dominated by talks of Mr. Price and the building. One night, Brahmananda explained why he had given Mr. Price $1,000. Mr. Price had asked for something to work with. It was like earnest money, and it was also for a tip Mr. Price had to take to Swamiji had taught them to use receipts, at least amongst themselves. Gargamuni and Swarupa, as treasurer and secretary, signed each voucher, and Gargamuni kept the vouchers on file. These included requests for items like 50 cents for a hat and $3 for sneakers. Brahmananda said he had mentioned a written statement to Mr. Price, but had not pressed the matter. Anyway, it wasn't necessary or even desirable since they were not simply conducting business with Mr. Price, but cultivating a relationship. Mr. Price was a well-wisher, a friend who was helping them as charity. He was going to do big things and use his influence to get the building. This $1,000 was just a gesture to show their interest and to show Mr. Price's friends the devotees were not joking. They had some money. In fact, devotees had $10,000, $5,000 in small donations, and a $5,000 donation from a wealthy hippie. In addition to donations, the temple had a regular monthly income of $800, Brahmananda's $400 paycheck from his job as a substitute teacher for the New York City public school system, and the $400 paycheck Satsvarupa earned as a caseworker for the welfare department. But the devotees were in no position to buy any building, and they knew it. All the more reason Brahmananda explained at the Ishtagoshti why they had to depend on Mr. Price. After all, he reasoned Swamiji himself had inspired them to look for a 100,000 building. Swamiji knew they couldn't pay for such a building except in some extraordinary way. And Mr. Price, Brahmananda figured, must be the way. Swamiji wanted the building. No sooner had he reached San Francisco than he had written back. I'm very anxious to hear about the final decision of the House. I wish to open the House by the 1st of March 1967, and the arrangement may be done dexterously in this connection. The assembled devotees listened to Brahmananda's explanation, sympathized, and added their own understanding of how Krishna and Swamiji were working. There were a few contrary remarks and opinions, but basically everyone agreed Brahmananda's dealings with Mr. Price were all right. When Kirtananda and Rama returned to New York from San Francisco, they consulted with Brahmananda. Then Brahmananda went to Mr. Price, who promised that if somehow they couldn't get the building, he would return at least $750. The balance of the money represented traveled in the devotees' interest, but they would get the building, Mr. Price assured him. Then Mr. Price told Brahmananda the latest. He had found a wealthy financier, Mr. Hall, who had almost agreed to pay the full $100,000 for the building. Mr. Price was working on Mr. Hall, who happened to be his close friends. Prospects seemed good, but the devotees would also have to do their part, Mr. Price explained. By putting up $5,000, Mr. Price would then arrange everything else. Mr. Price set up a meeting with an architect on Park Avenue, and soon Brahmananda and Satsvarupa were sitting with Mr. Price and his architect friend, reviewing sketches. To give the building that authentic Indian temple look, the architect proposed a facade with arches and, if they liked, domes. It was wonderful. Of course, they didn't dare ask him how much it would cost, but Mr. Price even hinted that the work might be done free. After Mr. Price served himself and his architect friend some liquor and offered some of the boys to the boys, although he knew they would not accept it, the two men held up tinkling glasses, smiled, and politely toasted themselves and the boys, saying, Hare Krishna. While going down on the elevator, Mr. Price spoke eloquently of the devotee's faith in God. He said that others might argue about the existence of God, but the most convincing thing was the devotee's personal experience. Your personal testimony, Mr. Price assured them, is the best argument. It is a very powerful thing. The boys nodded. Later, among themselves, they laughed about the liquor, but still they figured these men wanted to help. When Śrila Prabhupada heard about the latest developments, he did not share his disciples' optimism. On February 3rd, he wrote Gargamuni, I had a talk with your brother Brahmananda yesterday on the dial. I'm glad that Mr. Price had promised to return the amount of $750 in case no sale contract is made. But in any case, you should not pay any partly more than what you have already paid, either to the lawyer or to Mr. Price, unless there is an actual sale contract made. It appears to me very gloomy about the transaction because there was no basic understanding before the payment of $1,000 either to the lawyer or to the real estate. This is not businesslike. Unless there is a basic understanding, where is the way of transaction? If there was no basic understanding, why so much waste of time and energy? I cannot understand. And if there was basic understanding, why is it changed so quickly? I'm therefore perturbed in the mind. Why, when there was no basic understanding, what was the need of appointing lawyer? Anyway, it is my advice that you should consult me before issuing any further money. but I hope you will make the transaction successful without further delay. Srila Prabhupada had also instructed Gargamuni to protect the $10,000 in the bank and never withdraw any sum that would leave a balance of less than 6,000. Prabhupada had left one account for which the devotees were the signers, but he also had an account for which he controlled the funds. He now asked the devotees to put $6,000 from the account into his. He wrote Brahmananda, "This 6,000 will be transferred forthwith by me as soon as there is a sale contract for purchase of the house." On February 10, Prabhupada wrote to Kirtananda, "Regarding the house, I was correct in my remarks that there was no definite understanding. In such negotiations, everything is done in black and white. Nothing is being done in black and white, but everything is being done based on Mr. Price." Let this understanding be completed within the 1st of March 1967 and close the chapter. I think this is my last word in his connection. You're all grown-up boys and you use your discretion and you can now complete the transaction without prolonging it indefinitely. If, however, we are not able to purchase the house, it does not mean closing our activity at 26 2nd Avenue. So there is no question of packing up and coming to San Francisco. Then on February 15, Prabhupada wrote Sasvarupa. So far I can see from the correspondence of Ramananda, it is not possible for us to get the house for so many reasons. The main reason is that we have no money to pay cash and nobody is going to invest cash in that house because it is neither complete nor has any income. It is simply utopian to think of possessing the house, and Mr. Price is simply giving us false hope. You're all innocent boys without any experience of the world. The cunning world can befool you at any time. So please be careful of the world in Krishna consciousness. When Krishna will desire, the house will come to us automatically. Srila Prabhupada's doubts were confirmed when Mr. Price wrote to him asking for money. If Mr. Price had so much money, Prabhupada reasoned, why was Mr. Price asking him for money? On February 17, Srila Prabhupada wrote to Mr. Price to impress upon him that there would have to be a sale contract before ISKCON could actually purchase the building. If there is sale contract, my students here and in New York will be able to raise the fund very seriously. In the absence of any sale contract, everything appears to be in the air, and Mr. Tyler or his lawyer can change his word as he has already done. Srila Prabhupada's message was clear. Brahmananda, however, complained of poor communications. Things were always changing, and Brahmananda wasn't always able to get Swamiji's confirmation for the latest changes. Swamiji would write his instructions in a letter, and although the devotees had to obey whatever he said, the circumstances would often have changed by the time they received the letter. Swamiji would also sometimes change his opinion when he heard new information. Sometimes Ramananda would call San Francisco and Swamiji wouldn't be available. Ramananda didn't feel right about sending messages through the devotees in San Francisco because he knew that the devotees there were skeptical about the whole transaction. If New York got the building, San Francisco could have to donate $1,000. And the devotees in San Francisco, of course, had their own plans for how to spend money for Krishna. Mr. Price suggested to the devotees in New York that maybe the Swami did not understand American business dealings. With all respect, His Excellency couldn't be expected to know all the intricacies of finance in a foreign country. And His Excellency's request for a purchase contract was, as Mr. Price put it, something that went out with hoop skirts. Brahmananda and Satsvarupa did not know how to reply. The remarks seemed like blasphemy, but Brahmananda and Satsvarupa were already entangled in the promises Mr. Price had given and went on meeting with him. They would meet with Mr. Price and then ride back to 2nd Avenue on the subway, chanting Hare Krishna. Srila Prabhupada wrote almost daily to various devotees in New York. On February 18, he wrote a letter to Brahmananda with the word confidential typed at the top of the page. Now, if you think he's able to secure money for us, if you think that there is something hopeful by this time, then you can continue the negotiation as he's doing. But do not, for Krishna's sake, advance a partling more on any plea by him. He may be trying his best, but he's not capable to do this. That is my honest opinion. While trying to avoid further losses in New York, Prabhupada continued his active preaching in San Francisco. Mukunda and the others were lining up lots of engagements, and the reception was often enthusiastic. In the same confidential letter to Brahmananda, in which Prabhupada put forward his strategies for negotiating with Mr. Price and Company, he also wrote glowingly of grand successful meetings at various Bay Area colleges. The meetings were very similar, he said, to the wonderful kirtanas in Tompkins Square Park. This was the way to spread Krishna consciousness, not by becoming entangled with treacherous real estate agents. I'm enclosing here with a copy of the letter received from Himalayan Academy. See how they are appreciating our method of peace movement. So in this way, we have to forward our cause. No businessman will come forward to help us on utopian schemes as contemplated by Mr. Price. We have to try for ourselves. So the summary is to obtain a higher purchase to sale contract from Mr. Tyler and popularize our movement by outdoor engagement as many as possible. Srila Prabhupada had done that what he could. The boys were foolish, even to the point of not listening to him, but they had raised the money themselves. If, despite his instructions, they lost it, what further help could he give? So he simply went on with his San Francisco preaching and advised the boys in New York also to become convinced of achieving success through Kirtana.
The new Jagannath Puri. Srila Prabhupada put a sweater over his turtleneck jersey, wrapped his chadara around his shoulders, and left his apartment, accompanied by a few disciples. The weather was beautiful, and the blue, cloudless sky reminded him of India. An hour before, he had sent devotees ahead to start a kirtana, and now one of the girls had come running back to him, excitedly knowing on his door and announcing, Swamiji, there are so many people. The clay mridangas he had ordered many months ago from Calcutta had recently arrived. Today would be one of the first times he would play a genuine clay mridanga in America. The boys and girls would like it. He had arranged for the drums to be wrapped in cloth and had cautioned the boys to be careful because the clay drums broke easily. The walk to the park was short, and as usual, Prabhupada walked faster than his young followers. They walked down Frederick Street to Stanion, where they turned the corner at the donut shop frequented by Hell's Angels and still sometimes visited by certain devotees. On Stanion, they hurried past the parking lot of Kesar Stadium, the stadium itself moving beyond. At the Wallen Street intersection, Prabhupada continued his rapid stride without stopping or even bothering to look at the light. One of the boys. You got mad? Got mad? One of the boys caught his arm. Wait, Swamiji, the light. But Prabhupada darted across the street. As they continued down Stanion towards Haight Street, the park appeared on the right. They entered, walking past a duck pond with a fountain and a willow tree on its center island. They walked past all redwoods and eucalyptus trees, which lent fragrance to the surrounding area. There were also maple, oak, and ash trees and flowering shrubs, like azaleas. Prabhupada said that the park resembled parks in Bombay and that the city was like a holy place because it was named after Saint Francis. They entered a 50-foot-long tunnel with artificial satellites hanging from the ceiling and came out onto a path heavily shaded by trees on either side. Just ahead was the meadow, covered with tiny daisies and clover and encircled by redwood and eucalyptus trees. Prabhupada could hear the chanting, the kartalas, and the booming of timpani. As he entered the meadow, he saw a sloping hill dotted with hundreds of young people, sitting, lying, lounging, smoking, throwing frisbees, or walking around, and in the meadow below the hill was his kirtana. The meadow was a popular place. People walked through it on the way to the zoo or the tennis courts. But today, many passers-by had stopped and were listening in a group, about 200 feet from the kirtana. Closer in, about 50 feet from the kirtana, was another group, listening more intently. And then there was the kirtana party itself, the Prabhupada's disciples and dozens of young hippies, sitting tightly together and chanting, and others were standing nearby, clapping and swaying to the rhythm of the drum and kartalas. Flags decorated the kirtana area, 3 feet by 4 feet. They had been made by devotees and each bore the symbol of a different religion. A bright red flag with a yellow star and the crescent moon of Islam flew from a 10-foot bamboo pole stuck into the earth. Beside it waved a pale blue flag with a dark blue star of David in the center. And beside that, a yellow flag bore the Sanskrit Omkara. Prabhupada's disciples, with their long hair and casual clothes, were indistinguishable from other young dancers and singers, except for the strands of large red chanting beads around their necks. Some of the devotees danced with arms upraised against the background of uninterrupted blue sky. Others played instruments. The kartalas and timpani were there. Hayagriva had brought his cornet, and there were other instruments brought by devotees and hippies. Little children were taking part. Even a stray dog pranced in the innermost circle of Kirtana party. On Sundays, the meadow beneath Hippie Hill was always an open show, and today the Kirtana was the featured attraction. Prabhupada joined the Kirtana, walking up suddenly to the surprise and delight of the devotees. He sat down and began playing the mridanga and leading the singing in a loud voice. Mukunda, although we had heard Swamiji play different drums before and some of us had played along with him, when he played the clay mridanga from India, it was a completely different feeling. The feeling it created was akin to seeing an old friend after many, many years. It was so right and so natural. It was the very thing our kirtanas had been missing, and it increased our feelings of ecstasy many times over. Obviously, Swamiji was in great ecstasy than ever. You could sense by the way he held the drum, by the ease with which he brought out its intricate rhythms to control the kirtana, that his drum was like a long-lost friend to him. Swamiji playing that drum was the talk of the community. Now we knew what kirtana really was, how it was supposed to sound, what it was really like. Prabhupada was the center of attraction. Even his age and dress made him prominent, whereas the others in the park were mostly young people dressed in denims or various hippie costumes. Prabhupada was 70 and distinctly dressed in saffron robes, and the way the devotees had all cheered and bowed before him were now looking at him so lovingly caused onlookers to regard him with curiosity and respect. As soon as he had sat down, some young children had gathered in close to him. He had smiled at them, deftly playing the mridanga, enthralling and entertaining them with his playing. Govinda Dasi. With Swamiji's arrival, there was a mastery and an authority about the whole Kirtana that was absent before. We were no longer kids in San Francisco chanting Hare Krishna. Now we had historical depth and meaning. Now the Kirtana had credentials. His presence established the ancient historical quality of the chanting. When Swamiji came, the whole disciplic succession came. After an hour of chanting, Prabhupada started the Kirtana and addressed the crowd. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. This is the sound vibration, and it is to be understood that the sound vibration is transcendental. And because it is transcendental vibration, therefore it appeals to everyone, even without understanding the language of the sound. This is the beauty. Even children respond to it. After speaking 5 minutes, Prabhupada began the Kirtana again. One woman with long, uncombed red hair began dancing back and forth and chanting, her baby in her arms. A man and woman sitting side by side played together on the heads of a pair of bongos. Subala, in the tight corduroy pants and flowing white shirt, danced in a semblance of the steps Swamiji had shown him. Although Subala looked somewhat like an American Indian dancer. A little girl, no more than 4 years old, sat cross-legged, playing kartalas and chanting seriously. A suave-looking fellow wearing a vest and round glasses played castanets against his palm. Ravindra Swarupa sat rocking back and forth as he played the drone on the harmonium. Beside him, Hayagriva chanted forcefully, his head and upper body lunging forward and back, his long hair and beard jutting out widely, while nearby a girl stood with her right arm around one boy and her left arm around another, all three of them swaying back and forth, singing with peaceful, blissful smiles, enjoying the chanting and the sunshine. One girl sat silently meditating, while beside her a girl danced proactively and a 5-year-old beside the dancing girl played with 2 balloons. Prabhupada sat his mridanga aside and stood, playing kartalas and swaying among the dancers, his feet moving in a stately measure. A big black man danced nearby, facing his white girlfriend, both of them moving as if they were at the Avalon. The girl shook her body and head in wild abandon, and her long straight hair completely covered her face. Bright blonde Nandarani stood on Prabhupada's right, playing kartalas. Sometimes Prabhupada stopped singing and simply observed the scene, his mouth closed in a stern yet sublimely tolerant expression. Some of the young people joined hands, forming a circle, and began to dance around and around in front of Swamiji. Then they encircled him, and as he looked on, still swaying and now clapping solemnly, they danced around him hand in hand, jumping and wriggling and chanting Hare Krishna. The soft pink-blue hue of his khadi robes contrasting with the pie dress of the hippies, Swamiji looked unusual and wonderful, watching and solemnly sanctioning the Kirtana performance. The dancing was free form and sensuous, but that was the way these young people expressed their feelings through their bodies. They bounced and bounced into the air. Sometimes the circle of dancers would break and become a single line, weaving in and out among the people sitting on the grass, in and out among the silk flags. A muscular boy held the hand of a girl wearing long dark braids and a black headband in American Indian style. At the end of the line, a boy held a girl's hand with his left hand, while with his right he held a wooden recorder to his mouth and tooted as he weaved in and out of the crowd. Prabhupada became tired and sat beside the brass-bottomed timpani. Singing and playing kartalas, he sat grave and straight like an ancient sage. Nearby, a blonde woman sat in yogic posture, bending her body forward until her forehead touched the ground again and again, in supplication or exhibition. Another girl stretched out her hands imploringly in a mixed expression of inner feelings, physical and spiritual, while her golden earrings jangled. A Mexican in a checkered shirt beat a tom-tom. A white sheepdog wandered from person to person. Swamiji looked kind and amused. The hippies found him beautiful. He remained gentlemanly, aloof amid the twisting, shaking, rocking, dancing young people. Amid their most sensual movements, he appeared not at all like them, for he moved in a stately, elderly way. As he surveyed the activities in the meadow, he seemed deeply pleased to see the ring of dancers singing all around him, chanting Hare Krishna. Although the enthusiasm of these hippies was often wild and sensual, the gathering assumed a wholesome sweetness due to the chanting of Hare Krishna. For Swamiji, the main thing was that the chanting was going on and on. Dressed in his saffron cloth that seemed to change colors subtly in the fading afternoon sunlight, he watched in a kindly, fatherly way, not imposing any restraint, but simply inviting everyone to chant Hare Krishna. 25-year-old Linda Katz was walking in the park when she heard the sound of the kirtana. In the crowd of hundreds of people gathered around the scene, Linda found it easy to go close without becoming conspicuous. She felt comfortable watching and even thought of joining the fun. Then she noticed the Swami leading the singing. She was startled, even a little frightened, having never before seen anyone so grave. He was striking, and the dancers appeared beautiful to her. A girl with arms upraised and eyes closed seemed to be swinging like a tree in the wind. One of the men was tall and attractive, with golden curly hair, and Linda saw a boy she knew from college in New York, a crazy boy who always wore a shocking big wool cap. Linda had arrived in San Francisco from New York only a few days ago. She had no plans except to study under a certain dance teacher and maybe get into some of the exciting things she had heard were going on in Haight Ashbury. Haight Ashbury. As a graduate student in ancient Greek literature at Columbia University, Linda had become attracted to Socrates, who had lived and died for truth. But she hadn't found any of her professors to be at all like Socrates. She had envisioned herself living a life of truth by pursuing scholarship, but it had become dry. The ancient civilization of Greece was a dead idea, not a living truth. It didn't touch the heart. She had been aching for a new, exciting experience, and she was ready to throw herself into San Francisco's hippie society. She had come here alone, giving up her fashionable clothes and donning bell bottoms and old shirts. But because she wanted to be serious, she felt awkward, trying to fit in with the hippies. She felt that to belong, she was supposed to wipe the serious look off her face and just smile mindlessly. So even in the society of San Francisco's hippies, she remained unsatisfied and lost. The kirtana in the park was the most beautiful sight Linda had ever seen. The dancers were swaying back and forth, their arms raised against the open sky, and in the middle of the dance was a dark, gray-haired white person sitting and chanting. As she moved in closer, she began to sway with the devotees. Then she sat down and started chanting, wanting to find out what was going on. After more than an hour of chanting, the elderly leader finally stopped the kirtana, and Linda began talking to some of the devotees. Although the Swami had slipped away, some of his followers had remained, handing out flyers and invitations to the Sunday love feast and picking up the timpani and the flags. One of them asked her to come with them to the temple. Linda found the devotees to be something like hippies, but not scruffy street people like most of the hippies she had met. They were attractive, not repellent. Madrasas and plants decorated their little storefront temple. When she stopped before a painting of people singing and dancing, one of the devotees said, "This is Lord Chaitanya and his associates." A devotee gave her some prasadam, and Linda left that night without meeting the Swami. Next day, however, at 7 in the morning, she returned, eager for another chance to see him. She thought he had noticed her at the park and might remember her. She had made a drawing of him and she wanted to show him. That morning, as Prabhupada chanted prayers and led Kirtana, Linda didn't take her eyes off him. And when he asked everyone to chant Hare Krishna with him on beads, She excitedly accepted a strand from one of the devotees and tried to chant like him. Then he began reading the Sanskrit verse to begin his lecture, and Linda was captivated by the sound. If she were to continue with her graduate program in Greek, she would study Sanskrit next. So she listened with keen interest, proud that perhaps no one else in the room could understand as well as she. Later that same morning, she met Srila Prabhupada upstairs in his apartment. Linda, in the first conversation I had with him, Swamiji summed up Greek civilization for me in a couple of sentences. He explained that Srimad Bhagavatam was the source of stories like the Iliad and the Odyssey and was the source of Platonic philosophy. I was thrilled, of course. I believed him. I knew that whatever he was speaking was the truth. There was no doubt in my mind, and he didn't discourage my love for Socrates. He told me that Socrates was actually a devotee in disguise. Then he began telling me the story of Krishna as the butter thief. And I said, oh yes, I know that story. I saw a dance about Krishna as the butter thief. He was very pleased and he laughed. He said, oh yes, you know. This encounter with Swamiji was like meeting an old friend because I felt completely at home and protected. And I felt I had found what I was looking for. Here, I could use my intelligence and ask the questions I had always wanted to ask in school. Prabhupada initiated Linda, giving her name Lilamrta. Seeing her eagerness to serve him personally, he decided to teach her to cook by having her prepare his lunch. He already had a little weekend cooking class in which he taught Janaki, Govindadasi, Nandarani, and others the art of cooking for Krishna. Now he invited Lilavati to come. He would walk back and forth in the small room, showing the girls how to knead dough, cook chapatis, measure spices in the right palm, and cut vegetables and cook them in ghee with masala. The foods were basic: rice, chapatis, cauliflower with potatoes, but he wanted to teach the girls precisely how to cook. Mukunda. One day, just out of curiosity, I went in to witness Swamiji's cooking classes. So I came in and stood at the doorway to Swamiji's kitchen. The women were there learning how to cook. And Swamiji said to me, what are you doing? Oh, I said, I just came to see my wife. Then Swamiji said, are you going back to Godhead or back to wife? Everyone was amused, and I realized I wasn't welcome, so I left. The incident made me reflect on Swamiji's seriousness. For one thing, I learned that I should not be so attached to my wife. And secondly, I learned that his relationship with the women and what he was teaching them was actually very sacred, not like the sometimes frivolous association between husband and wife. Because he spent many hours in the kitchen teaching them, they were very inspired. Lilavati tended to be proud. Many of the devotees were not college graduates, and none of them were classical scholars. She sometimes typed for Swamiji, did his wash, or brought flowers to his room in the morning. And he had quickly chosen her to be his exclusive cook. After only a few days of cooking lessons, Swamiji had told her, all right, you cook. And now he came in only occasionally to check on her. Once when he saw her rolling chapatis, he said, oh, you have learned very nicely. Preparing Swamiji's meals just right, with the proper spicing, without burning anything, and on time was a challenge. By the time Lilavati finished, she would be perspiring and even crying from tension. But when she brought in his lunch, he would ask her to bring an empty plate, and he would serve her portions from his own plate and invite her to eat with him. For the first few days, Lilavati made remarks about the wonderful taste of the prasadam, and Swamiji would smile or raise his eyebrows. But then she noticed that he never spoke while eating, but seemed to be concentrating intensely as he sat, cross-legged, bending his body over the plate of prasadam and eating with his right hand. One day on Ekadasi, Lilavati arrived late at Swamiji's apartment, thinking there would not be much cooking on a fast day. But when she entered the kitchen, she found Swamiji himself busily cooking. He was heating something white in a skillet, vigorously stirring and scraping it from the bottom of the pan. Oh, he said, I was just wondering, where is that girl? Lilavati was too shy to ask what Swamiji was doing, so she simply busied herself cutting vegetables. Today is a fast day, she said, as if chiding Swamiji for cooking. You have to understand, he replied. In Krishna consciousness, a fast day means a feast day. We are offering this to Krishna. Lilavati continued to keep her distance from Swamiji's whitish, sticky-looking preparation until he completed it and placed it on the windowsill to cool. Later, it will harden, he said, and we can cut it and serve it. And with that, he turned and walked out of the kitchen. When Lilavati finished cooking and served Swamiji his Ekadasi lunch, he asked her to bring him some of that thing on the windowsill. He took a bite, seemed pleased, and asked Lilavati to call Mukunda and Janaki to taste it. Janaki took a bite and exclaimed, it's wonderful, simply wonderful, incredible. What is this? Turning to Lilavati, Swamiji asked, what is in this preparation? I don't know, Swamiji, she said. You don't know? He replied. You were standing right next to me in the kitchen, and you don't remember? Lilavati's face turned red. Oh, Swamiji, Lilavati replied, I was very busy, I just didn't see. Oh, you are busy without intelligence, he replied, and he laughed for a long time until Mukunda was also laughing. Lilavati felt even more humiliated. Swamiji asked Janaki if she could tell what was in that preparation. She couldn't, except that it was sweet. He then sent Lilavati downstairs to get Govinda Dasi and Gaura Sundara. When they entered, Swamiji told Lilavati, go get some of that simply wonderful thing. Again, this time in front of 4 devotees, Swamiji asked Lilavati, so what is in this preparation? And again she defended herself. She had been too busy to notice. And again he laughed until everyone was laughing with him. He then asked Govinda Dasi to taste the simply wonderful and say what was in it. Immediately she guessed. Sugar, butter, powdered milk. Oh, Swamiji looked at Lilavati. She's an artist. She's intelligent. To Lilavati, the whole episode was a devastating ordeal. Only later did she understand that Swamiji had been trying to teach her humility. It was 7 a.m. Srila Prabhupada sat on his dais in the temple. Beside him on the altar stood the recently acquired statue of Krishna. The child Krishna stood 2 feet high, with his left hand on his hip, his right hand holding a rod. Gurudasa had found him at an import store and had begged the manager to sell him. And after several visits, the man had agreed $45. Prabhupada had given him the name Karta Mahasya, the boss. This morning, as Prabhupada and Karta Mahasya looked out at the devotees in the room, only about 6 people were present. The night before, the temple had been crowded. Where are the others? Prabhupada asked. Then he gave the answer himself. They're all sleeping. All the sleeping is not good. He took out his kartalas and began playing the 1-2-3 rhythm. Mukunda took up a mridanga and played along, trying to execute the rhythms of Srila Prabhupada had recently taught him. Srila Prabhupada had not even begun singing when the door opened and half a dozen barefoot hippies wandered in, reeking of marijuana. They glanced around, then sat down on the floor with the devotees as Prabhupada began singing Guru Ashtakam, the Vaishnava prayers to the spiritual master. Although none of his disciples knew the words, they loved to listen to Swamiji sing these morning prayers. Unhurriedly, he sang each verse several times, repeating each line, deliberately developing the mood of unadulterated service to the spiritual master. Then one of the hippies, a boy with long, straight blonde hair and a red headband, began mumbling, fidgeting and moaning. Someone softly asked him to be quiet. The boy paused, but then moaned again. Swamiji and his followers were asked to drugged hippies who stayed up all night and came to the morning program, sometimes disrupting things. Usually, the visitors remained submissive, and even if they occasionally called out in a strange mood, they usually found peace in chanting Hare Krishna and would try to blend with the energy of the devotees. But today's discordant visitor seemed agitated by the chanting, as if it were challenging him. Rather, he sounded like he was challenging it. The devotees began clapping in time with Prabhupada's kartalas. And when Prabhupada began singing Hare Krishna, his half dozen followers immediately joined him, chanting both lead and chorus. Prabhupada looked at them gravely, encouraging the bedraggled early morning band of youngsters, and they responded determinedly. The guests sat in drugged contemplation, although one or two tried singing along, but the blond boy with red headband remained adamantly disharmonious, moaning defiantly, as if trying to throw off the effects of the chanting. Nonetheless, despite the boy's moaning, which was sometimes loud and savage, Prabhupada kept singing and the devotees kept chanting. Mukunda and Hayagriva exchanged anxious glances but tolerated the boy, unsure what else to do. Some of the devotees were disturbed and even frightened, but they had also heard Swamiji say in recent lectures that the advanced devotees aren't shaken in any circumstances. Swamiji was their leader, not only in devotional prayers, but also in how to respond to this intruder. So they waited and watched him for a sign. Prabhupada remained undisturbed, but although after 20 minutes, the Kirtana was strong and determined. The blond boy's madness was not going away. As chanting built up momentum, he began more agitated. He screamed like a lost soul and hollered like a rock singer. He was becoming more and more troubled and angry. When the devotees rose to their feet and began dancing, the boy began dancing too, but in his own way, crying and pounding his chest. Mukunda played louder on the drum. The sounds were discordant, a flash of individual madness and group chanting, until Prabhupada finally brought the Kirtana to a close. The devotees bowed their heads to the floor and Srila Prabhupada intoned the Sanskrit prayers honoring the spiritual masters, the Supreme Lord, and the sacred places. All glories to the assembled devotees, he said. They responded, Hare Krishna. All glories to the assembled devotees, Hare Krishna. All glories to the assembled devotees, Hare Krishna. Thank you very much, Srila Prabhupada said. And then, as was his morning custom, he announced, chant one round. Everyone sat down, including the crazy hippie. The devotees put aside the drums and kartalas, reached for their large red beads, and began chanting japa in unison. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Fingering one bead at a time, they uttered the mantra, then proceeded to the next bead. Surprised, at the turn of events, the blonde boy commented loudly, "Far out!" As rapid chanting filled with the room, the boy jumped to his feet and shouted, "Come with me." He whirled about, faced Srila Prabhupada and howled, "I'm God." Then he began screaming long, loud berserk cries. "Woohoo! Woohoo!" He sobbed, growled, grumbled, stomped his feet like a small child. He explored every sound his voice could make. Beating his fists on his chest again and again, he cried, "I'm God." And one of the boy's friends suddenly played a few notes on a panpipe. But Srila Prabhupada kept chanting japa, and the devotees also tried to continue chanting undaunted, while at the same time keeping an eye on Madman and wondering where it would all end. Then, with a final violent ejaculation, the boy shrieked, "I am God," and in anger and disgust strode out of the room, slamming the door behind him, yelling as he ran down the street. The proper japa peacefully engulfed the storefront, and Srila Prabhupada's voice assumed its place more clearly above the voices of all chanting devotees. After about 10 minutes of chanting, Prabhupada recited, "Sarvatma snapanam param vijayate Shri Krishna Sankirtanam." Let there be all glory to the congregational chanting of Hare Krishna, which cleanses the dirt from the mirror of mind and gives a taste of the nectar for which we are always hankering. As Prabhupada put on his spectacles and opened the Bhagavad Gita, he had been speaking each morning on the 6th chapter. The room settled and became silent for hearing his lecture. His students, some of whom had been imbibing his instructions for more than 2 months, listened attentively as he spoke the eternal parampara message. It was Krishna's timeless message, yet Swamiji was presenting it just for them as they sat on the rug early in the morning in small storefront, 518 Frederick Street in Haight-Ashbury. Prabhupada lectured on the transmigration of the soul. Foolish people, he said, aspire for material acquisitions. They don't know that these things are finished with the death of the body. Spiritual life, however, is of the utmost importance because it is never lost. So even if Krishna consciousness becomes inconvenient or uncomfortable, one should never give it up. Srila Prabhupada was again stressing that the devotee is never disturbed, a point that seemed especially relevant in the wake of this morning's interruption. A devotee, Prabhupada explained, is always tolerant. Prabhupada told a story about the great devotee Haridasa Thakura, a contemporary of Lord Chaitanya's, who endured severe beating at the hand of a Muslim magistrate. As Prabhupada told the story, he improvised a dialogue. "Oh," the magistrate said to Haridasa, "you are born in such a nice family and you're chanting Hare Krishna." And then Prabhupada spoke for Haridasa. "Sir, many Hindus also have become Mohammedan. So if some Mohammedan becomes Hindu, what is the harm?" Prabhupada didn't change the pitch or accent of his voice while taking different parts of the dialogue. But with a subtle storyteller's art, each voice became a distinct person. The magistrate spoke threateningly. "Oh, you're arguing?" Then Prabhupada became the narrator. "So it was decided that Haridasa was to be punished. Give the dog a bad name and hang it." Then Prabhupada became Haridasa's floggers, who, despite repeatedly beating Haridasa, was unable to make him cry out in pain. Finally exhausted, they spoke up. "Sir, the idea was that you would die, but now we see that you do not die. So now punishment is awaiting us." Haridasa, "What do you want?" The floggers, "What we want that you should die." Narrator, "Then he played himself into samadhi." and the floggers brought him to the magistrate. The magistrate, throw him in the water. Don't put him in the graveyard. He has become Hindu. Srila Prabhupada concluded his tale. The others were flogging him. He was chanting Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. He was undisturbed. He was steady. Therefore, Lord Krishna says that a person who is spiritually advanced, for him there is no misery, even in this world, and what to speak of the other world. A devotee suffers no loss, Prabhupada explained. Even if he doesn't become perfectly Krishna conscious, or even if he falls away, his next birth also will be human. There was a prince. Prabhupada began a story to illustrate his point. His name was Satyavan, but he was to die at a certain age, his horoscope said. But one girl named Savitri, she fell in love with that boy. Now she wanted to marry. Her father told her, he'll die at a certain age, you don't marry. But she was bent, she married. In course of time, the boy died, say after 4 or 5 years, and the girl became widowed. But she was so staunch lover that she won't let the dead body go away. And the Yamaraja, what is the English for one who takes away the body or soul after death? So he came to take the soul away. So this chaste girl would not allow the husband's body to go away. By Prabhupada's voice and widening eyes, he appeared as Yamaraja, the Lord of Death. Speaking to the widow Savitri, it is my duty that I should take. You give it up, otherwise you'll also be punished. The girl gave up her husband but followed behind Yamaraja. Then Prabhupada's Yamaraja, by a slight dropping of his voice, became compassionate. My dear girl, you go home. I give you benediction that you will have a son. Don't cry for your husband. But Savitri continued to follow Yamaraja. Yamaraja said, why are you following me? Then Prabhupada Savitri spoke, not in a feminine voice, but with the reasoning and her heart of Savitri. Now you're taking my husband. How can I have my son? Prabhupada spoke as narrator. Oh, then he was in dilemma. He returned her husband. So similarly, there is a technique. If you take to Krishna consciousness, then your husband or this human form of life is guaranteed. The devotees understood the gist of the story, but they weren't perfectly clear what their lives had to do with the women in the story. Some, however, understood. If they took Krishna consciousness, their ill-destined lives could become auspicious. Yes, Srila Prabhupada continued, a spiritual life is the most auspicious life. He looked around emphatically at the devotees seated before him on the floor. Anyone who had done something nice, auspicious thing, oh, it will never be vanquished. He will never be put into difficulty. It is such a nice thing. He ended his lecture and asked for questions. A young woman raised her hand. You say that people foolishly worship the photograph of someone who has already gone. You gave the example of George Washington or Gandhi. But can the photo of a spiritual teacher be very helpful to teach others to love him? Prabhupada, yes. Those who are spiritually advanced, they are not different from their photograph. Just like here in the statue of Krishna is not different from Krishna. The original person Krishna and the statue of Krishna are just the same. Just like we are chanting Hare Krishna, Krishna and the name of Krishna are non-different. Do you realize it? If we are not getting some spiritual enlightenment by chanting Hare Krishna, then do you think we are simply wasting our time? No, we are not wasting our time. We are actually getting spiritual ecstasy because there is no difference. Similarly, a spiritually perfect person and his photograph is the same because it is in the absolute stage. Is that clear? Govinda Dasi raised her hand. You said that after leaving this body, a person in Krishna consciousness goes to a higher planet. Prabhupada, no, if you make perfection of Krishna consciousness, then after leaving this body, you go directly to Krishna. But if you are not perfect, if you have simply executed a certain percentage only, then you'll get the chance of another human body. But one who has understood what is Krishna, how Krishna takes his birth, how Krishna acts, he doesn't get any more material birth. Then where does he go? Tyaktva deham punarjanma naiti mameti. He comes to me. That means in the supreme abode of Krishna. Therefore, we should be very serious. Why should we wait for another birth, either in a very pious family or rich family or in other planet? This human body can give you the highest perfection, but we have to be very serious and try for that perfection. But we are not serious. We are not very serious. Actually, human civilization means that people should be very serious to have perfection of this human body. This is perfect human civilization. This is missing at the present moment. Srila Prabhupada sat in silence for several minutes, not moving. No one in the audience made a sound. Finally, he reached over his kartalas and began loudly ringing them together and singing, Govinda Jaya Jaya, Gopala Jaya Jaya. And the devotees joined him. Govinda Jaya Jaya, Gopala Jaya Jaya. Radharamana Hari. Radharamana Hari, Govinda Jaya Jaya, Gopala Jaya Jaya. It was Prabhupada's desire to see his disciples raise their Krishna consciousness to 100% in their present lifetime. They could do it too because the chanting was absolutely potent. If there was something they didn't understand, he would explain it. Govinda Dasi hadn't understood. She had thought that a devotee was meant to go to a higher planet, but now she understood. And he had told them to become more serious. He knew they sometimes went to the donut shop and even smoked cigarettes after Kirtana, and he tolerated it. But he let them know that he really wanted them to be completely serious. Unless they were completely serious, they might have to go to a higher planet within the material universe. And what good was that? To rise to a human birth took many lifetimes. Human life was meant for perfection, so they should be serious. But he said, we are not serious. After the Kirtana, Srila Prabhupada left the storefront and returned to his apartment. Hayagriva, turning to Haridasa, asked why no one had thrown the crazy boy out. In New York, Hayagriva said, Brahmananda would have removed him at the first outburst. You have to be careful with hippies here, Haridasa explained. Tactful is the word. In this neighborhood, if someone walks around high on LSD, people automatically assume that he's due all the respect of God and should be tolerated. They come in and jump up and down and scream, but we can't lay a hand on them because they are LSD saints. But if we had touched the boy this morning, the whole neighborhood would be down on us. The diggers next door are pretty noisy, but they unplug their jukebox during lectures, and they've been very friendly, giving us clothing and helping us decorate the temple. Sometimes the Hells Angels go over there and raise a lot of noise, and sometimes they even come in here. If they do, best to humor them. They're always trouble. That very morning, some Hells Angels started a fight in the digger store. The devotees could hear thuds and screams through the walls as a big black beat up 3 Hells Angels. The brawl ended only after a police car and an ambulance arrived. Afterwards, about a dozen people drifted into the temple, talking about the brawl. Harsharani put out extra plates for the guests. One day in March, 18-year-old Wayne Gunderson was walking down the street when a piece of paper blowing along the sidewalk caught on his foot. He tried to kick it off without breaking his stride, but it hung on. Then he stopped and tried to kick it off. He couldn't. He reached down and picked it off and found it was a flyer. Stay High Forever, advertising lectures by Swami Bhaktivedanta at 518 Frederick Street. Like so many others, Wayne, a mild-mannered young man who worked for the post office, had come to hate Ashbury to take part in the revolution. He attended rock concerts and be-ins, browsed through the books and posters in the psychedelic shops, shared an apartment with his girlfriend and other couple, and took drugs. But he was quiet, polite, and solitary. He didn't dress like a hippie, but wore clean, conservative, casual clothes and a whimsical, odd-looking sports cap. The flyer about the Swami seemed a timely coincidence. Because Wayne had been planning to go to India to find a guru, he decided to go see Swami Bhaktivedanta on Frederick Street. Wayne was surprised to find only a storefront. He was startled by the picture of the Swami in the window. No smiling, bearded yogi, but a shaven-headed Swami with a stern look. Wayne went in. It was a typical Haight-Ashbury scene, with hippies sitting around. But there were also a few people with big red beads, strung like garlands around their necks. And up front, he saw the Swami. Wayne was impressed as Prabhupada began chanting Hare Krishna, and he found the lecture firm and authoritative. The Swami stressed, "We are not these bodies." And when he spoke of Krishna, he described Krishna so personally that it was like being introduced to Krishna. After a few minutes, Wayne got up, the nerve to ask a question. One can practice Hatha Yoga at the same time as Krishna consciousness? Oh, why do you want to spend so much time with that body? Prabhupada replied, and Wayne felt Prabhupada's eyes look deep within him. You're not that body, he said it so strongly that Wayne, who was easily hurt, felt like shrinking into the floor. This body is not as important as the soul, Srila Prabhupada explained. So we shouldn't spend so much time with the body, exaggerating its needs. Then he smiled at Wayne. Besides, all yogas culminate in Krishna consciousness. And Wayne felt that smile lift him completely out of his diminished and crushed condition. Several weeks later, Wayne asked about initiation. When the devotees told him he should go up and see the Swami, Wayne went home and rehearsed his lines first. Anticipating what Prabhupada would say, Wayne prepared his own responses and contrived the whole conversation. Then, nervously, he approached Prabhupada's door. But before he could even knock, the door opened, and there was Prabhupada, looking at him not sternly, as in his picture, but kindly, as if expecting him. Yes, Prabhupada said, come in. The incident completely shattered Wayne's planned approach. He concluded that Swamiji could read minds. So trying to clear his mind of bad thoughts, he entered Prabhupada's apartment. Prabhupada sat in his rocking chair, and Wayne, who usually sat on the floor, sat in the only other chair in the room. Wayne immediately felt uncomfortable as he realized that it would be more proper to sit at Prabhupada's feet. But feeling too weak-hearted to alter the situation, he kept his seat. Nervously fingering his sports cap, Swamiji, he began, I would like to be your disciple. Prabhupada immediately agreed. He asked whether Wayne could follow the four regulative principles. And Wayne, although not even sure what the four principles were, said he could. Prabhupada then asked him what principle was the most difficult for him to follow. Well, he said, I have difficulty with meat eating. A lie. He was a vegetarian, but he was too shy to say that his real problem was uncontrolled sex desire. Prabhupada laughed. Oh, that's no problem. We will give you prasadam. You can be initiated next week. Wayne then asked if he could be able to go to India. He felt the Swami would be pleased to hear that his new follower wanted to go to his country. But Prabhupada seemed displeased. India? Why India? Wayne thought. The real reason he had wanted to go to India was to find a guru. Well, he said, to learn Sanskrit. I will teach you Sanskrit, Prabhupada replied. So there was no need to go to India, and he would be initiated by a genuine guru next week, right here in San Francisco. Some devotees helped Wayne prepare for his initiation ceremony. Hayagriva lent Wayne his dhoti, a piece of yellow cloth, much too large for Wayne. Devotees set up a sacrificial arena in the storefront, a bed of earth, firewood, colored dyes, flowers. During the ceremony, Wayne was nervous. When Prabhupada chanted the mantras, Wayne could not hear them exactly, so he just mimicked as best as he could. And when Prabhupada began the fire sacrifice, Wayne felt a little frightened because the initiation seemed such a serious commitment. He watched Prabhupada gravely building the fire and saying the mantras. When Prabhupada initiated Wayne with his new name, Vendra, Wayne didn't hear it clearly and began to worry. Then the ceremony ended and Prabhupada stood up and abruptly left the storefront. Srila Prabhupada Lilamrta ki jai.